The campfire that went silent the Missouri River was quiet that night. Not completely quiet, of course. There was always some sound in the wilderness. Water moved slowly against the muddy riverbank. Leaves whispered high above the ground. Somewhere far beyond the circle of firelight, an unseen bird called once and then fell silent. The horses shifted occasionally in the darkness, their harnesses making the softest sound against the wooden stakes. To the men gathered around the small campfire, the wilderness seemed unusually still. It was late in the evening, during the long journey westward undertaken by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. The expedition had been traveling for months. They had crossed broad rivers, open grasslands, dense forests, and country that few people from the eastern United States had ever seen. Every day had brought something new, a different landscape, a different river, a different group of people, a different sky. And sometimes when darkness came, something far more difficult to understand, silence. Lewis sat close to the fire, holding a small notebook in one hand. The firelight moved across his face as he wrote. He had learned that the wilderness did not reveal itself all at once. It revealed itself slowly, a sound here, a footprint there, a distant light, a broken branch, a trail disappearing into tall grass, a river changing direction. There were always small things to notice. And sometimes the smallest things were the ones that stayed in the mind the longest. Across from him, William Clark sat quietly. He had finished his evening work. The day's observations had been recorded, the equipment had been checked, the animals had been secured, the men had eaten. The camp was settling down. One by one, voices had become quieter. A few men were already preparing their bedding. Others sat near the fire without speaking. They were tired, deeply tired. The kind of tiredness that comes from walking for hours, carrying equipment, guiding boats, repairing supplies, cutting through difficult country, and constantly paying attention to the land. They were thousands of miles from the comfortable towns and farms they had known. Behind them lay the familiar world. Ahead lay mountains that few of them had ever imagined. Lewis looked up from his notebook. For a moment he simply listened. The river, the wind, the fire, nothing unusual. Yet something about the night felt different. He closed the notebook. "Strange night," he said quietly. Clark looked toward him. So, Lewis did not answer immediately. He looked beyond the fire. The darkness began only a few steps from where they sat. The fire created a small island of light. Beyond it was the wilderness, trees, grass, riverbank, shadows. Everything beyond the fire seemed endless. "I don't know," Lewis finally said. "It just seems quiet." Clark gave a small smile. "We've had quieter nights." "Perhaps." Clark returned his attention to the fire. For several minutes neither man spoke. Then one of the men across the fire laughed softly at something another had said. The sound disappeared into the darkness. The fire cracked. A small spark rose into the air and vanished. Lewis opened his notebook again. He wrote a few more lines. The expedition continued. Even when the men slept, the journey continued in another sense. Their minds remained filled with unfamiliar places. Some dreamed of home. Some dreamed of rivers, some dreamed of mountains they had not yet seen, and some simply slept. The night grew colder. The moon was hidden behind thin clouds. The fire burned lower. Lewis placed another piece of wood onto the flames. The fire brightened. For a moment the entire camp seemed warm. Then something happened. The horses became restless. One of them lifted its head. Another turned toward the darkness. Clark noticed. He stood. "Easy," he whispered. The horse moved backward against its tether. Clark walked toward it. There was nothing visible, no animal, no person, no movement, only darkness. He waited. The horse slowly settled. Clark returned to the fire. "Probably a wolf," one of the men said. "Could be," Clark replied. Nobody worried. Wolves were part of the country, so were bears, so were countless smaller creatures. The wilderness was never empty. It only looked empty to those who did not know how to listen. The men returned to their quiet conversations. A few minutes passed. Then the wind stopped. Completely, the leaves stopped moving, the grass stopped whispering, the river seemed quieter, even the fire sounded different. Lewis looked up. Clark looked at him. Neither man said anything. One of the soldiers slowly turned his head. "You hear that?" someone answered. "Hear what?" "Nothing." Few men smiled, but the smile did not last, because he was right. There was almost nothing, no insects, no birds, no distant animal, no rustling grass, no movement among the trees, only the faint sound of the river. Lewis stood. He walked a few steps away from the fire. The darkness seemed unusually deep. He listened. Nothing. He returned. "Perhaps the wind will return," he said. The men nodded. Nobody wanted to make the silence into something more than it was. They had learned that fear could grow quickly in unfamiliar country. A branch could become a stranger. A distant animal could become a threat. A shadow could become a person. The wilderness encouraged imagination, and imagination, when tired, could become very convincing. So the men tried to remain calm. They waited. The fire continued burning, but the silence remained. Then, from somewhere far beyond the camp came a single sound, crack. A branch breaking, everyone heard it. The men turned toward the darkness. No one spoke. Another sound did not come. They waited, nothing. Clark looked toward Lewis. Lewis slowly picked up his rifle, not because he knew there was danger. He did not. He simply understood that in the wilderness, caution was often wiser than certainty. The men remained still. A minute passed, then another. Finally, Clark lowered his rifle. "Probably an animal," Lewis nodded. "Probably." The word remained in the air, probably. It was a useful word on an expedition like theirs. Probably a wolf, probably a deer, probably the wind, probably nothing. The men eventually returned to their bedding. The camp settled again. One by one, the voices disappeared. The fire became smaller. Lewis remained awake. He had spent enough nights outdoors to understand that sleep did not always come easily. There was something about the unknown that kept the mind awake. He looked toward the river. The moon had emerged from behind the clouds. Its pale light touched the water. The Missouri stretched into the darkness like a long silver road. Lewis thought about the distance they had already traveled. He thought about the men. He thought about the country ahead. And he wondered what they would see when morning came. Perhaps mountains. Perhaps another river. Perhaps a village. Perhaps nothing but miles of grass and trees. The expedition was a journey into uncertainty. Every sunrise opened another page. Every sunset closed one. Lewis pulled his blanket closer. The fire was now little more than glowing coals. Then he heard something. A faint sound, not from the river, not from the camp, from behind him. He turned, nothing. He waited. There it was again, soft, slow, almost like footsteps. He listened carefully. One step, then silence. Another step, then silence. Lewis remained still. His eyes adjusted to the darkness. He could see the outline of the trees. Nothing moved. He reached for his rifle before he could lift it. Clark spoke from behind him. "Awake too?" Lewis turned. Clark was sitting up. "Yes, I heard it." They both listened. The sound did not return. Clark stood and walked closer. Neither man wanted to wake the entire camp over a noise that might be nothing. They waited. The wilderness remained dark. Then a soft rustling came from the grass. This time it was closer. Clark raised one hand. They stopped, breathing for a moment. Something moved. A shadow crossed a patch of moonlight. Lewis tightened his grip on the rifle. The shadow stopped. Then two small eyes appeared. For a moment they stared at the men. And then the creature stepped into the light. It was a deer, a young deer. It stood at the edge of the camp, staring at the fire. Clark slowly lowered his hand. Lewis smiled. The deer remained there for several seconds. Then it turned. With 3 quiet steps, it disappeared into the darkness. Clark whispered, "So much for our mysterious visitor." Lewis smiled. "Perhaps." They returned to their places. The tension faded. The men slept. The fire continued to glow, and the night moved forward. But there was something they did not know. The silence that had surrounded their camp was not entirely natural. A storm was moving across the country. Far away, beyond the trees, clouds were gathering. The wind had changed direction. The air had become heavy. The wilderness was preparing for rain. And before morning, the men would understand why the night had become so still. Hours passed. The camp slept. The river moved. The clouds thickened. And then, just before dawn, first drop of rain touched the earth, then another, the fire hissed. A thin mist rose from the damp ground. The men began waking. Someone pulled a blanket over his head. Someone else cursed softly as rain touched his face. Clark opened his eyes. For a few moments he remained still, then he smiled. The mystery of the silent night had found an ordinary explanation. Weather. The simplest explanation was often the right one. The expedition would continue. The men would rise. They would prepare breakfast. They would inspect their equipment. They would check the boats. They would secure their supplies. And they would move west again. But nights like this would become part of the journey, not because something supernatural had happened, not because a monster had visited their camp, not because the wilderness had revealed some hidden secret, but because there was something deeply powerful about sleeping beneath an unfamiliar sky, far from roads, far from houses, far from the ordinary sounds of civilization. There was only the river. The trees, the rain, the fire, and the breathing of tired men. Lewis would later write about many things: plants, animals, rivers, mountains, weather, people, distances. But perhaps the wilderness was not only the things he could record. Perhaps it was also the things that could not easily be written down. The feeling of standing beneath an enormous sky, the strange comfort of a small fire, the uncertainty of darkness, the quiet before rain, the feeling that the land was older than any map. That night became one more memory in a journey filled with countless memories. And as the rain continued falling softly over the sleeping camp, the men rested. The river carried on beside them. The trees moved gently in the returning wind. The fire sank into ash. Morning waited beyond the darkness. And somewhere far ahead, beyond the next bend in the river, beyond the next forest and the next open plain, the unknown country was waiting. For now, there was nothing more to do. The journey could wait. River could wait. The mountains could wait. Even the future could wait. For a few quiet hours, the explorers could simply sleep. And the wilderness, vast and patient beneath the night sky, remained around them, silent, peaceful, endless. The morning arrived slowly. There was no sudden sunrise, no dramatic change in the wilderness. Only a gradual lightening of the eastern sky, as though the darkness were quietly stepping away. The rain had almost stopped. Drops still clung to the leaves, catching the first pale light of morning. Along the riverbank, the ground was dark and wet. Thin streams of water ran through the mud and disappeared into the Missouri. The men began waking one by one. Some remained beneath their blankets for a few extra minutes, listening to the rain. Others immediately began tending to the camp. There was a familiar rhythm to these mornings. Even after an uncomfortable night, there was work to be done. A fire needed to be rebuilt. Food needed to be prepared. Animals needed to be checked. Boats needed inspection. Equipment needed drying. And the journey had to continue. Clark stepped toward the river. He stood there quietly for a moment. The Missouri looked different after rain. Its surface was darker. The banks were softer. Mist floated just above the water. Across the river, the trees appeared almost blue in the morning haze. Clark watched a piece of driftwood move slowly downstream. It turned once, then disappeared around a bend. He wondered how far it had traveled. Perhaps it had broken from a tree many miles away. Perhaps the river had carried it through storms and quiet nights before bringing it here. The wilderness was full of journeys that nobody recorded. The men were simply one more thing moving through it. Lewis joined Clark near the river. "Morning," he said, "morning." They stood together. Neither spoke for several seconds. The silence of the previous night was gone. Birds had returned. Insects had begun their morning sounds. The horses moved restlessly. Men spoke around the fire. Somebody laughed. A metal cup struck against a cooking pot. Life had returned to the camp. Lewis looked toward the trees. "Quiet night," Clark smiled. "Very, perhaps too quiet." Clark glanced at him, still thinking about it. Lewis smiled. "Perhaps." Clark shook his head. "Sometimes a quiet night is only a quiet night." Lewis nodded. "Probably right." Neither man knew how often that simple sentence would prove useful during the expedition. They had entered a world where explanations were not always immediate. A strange track might belong to a small animal. A distant light might be reflected moonlight. A sudden silence might mean weather. A frightening sound might be nothing more than a tree breaking under its own weight. The farther they traveled, the more they learned to separate fear from observation. That was one of the most important skills of exploration. Not courage alone, not strength, observation. The wilderness demanded patience. It rewarded those who watched carefully. A person who hurried might miss a trail. A person who talked too loudly might frighten away animals. A person who ignored the weather could lose an entire day's progress. And a person who failed to notice the river could place everyone in danger. The expedition moved according to these small lessons. After breakfast, the men began preparing the boats. The rain had raised the river slightly. The current looked stronger. Clark inspected the equipment. Lewis checked several notes. The men secured the supplies. Soon the camp that had existed for only one night began disappearing. A blanket was folded. A cooking vessel was packed. Ropes were gathered. Tools were secured. The ashes of the fire were scattered carefully. Within an hour, there was almost nothing left. That was one of the strange things about their journey. They created small temporary worlds wherever they stopped. A fire, a few blankets, a handful of supplies, a circle of men. Then in the morning they disappeared. The wilderness swallowed their footprints. The grass stood upright again, the smoke faded, the river continued flowing, and another place became part of the long trail behind them. Lewis climbed into the boat. Before leaving, he looked once more toward the trees. He wondered how many nights they would spend like this, how many fires, how many storms, how many strange sounds. How many mornings would begin with the same quiet work? He could not know. The journey ahead was too large. The maps were incomplete. The mountains were still distant. And beyond those mountains lay a world that remained almost entirely unknown to the men. The boat pushed away from the bank. Wood scraped softly against wet earth. Then the current caught it. The expedition began moving again. The Missouri carried them west. For a while nobody spoke. There was something peaceful about traveling on the river after rain. The water moved steadily. Paddles dipped in and out. The sound repeated over and over: dip, pull, lift, dip, pull, lift. It became almost hypnotic. Some of the men watched the shore. Others looked toward the sky. Lewis sat with his notebook. He occasionally wrote something down. The landscape passed slowly: trees, grass, rock, water, then trees again. The expedition had already learned that the American frontier could be repetitive in the most beautiful way. The same colors appeared again and again: green forests, brown earth, blue-gray water, golden grass, pale sky. But the details were never exactly the same. Every bend of the river changed the view. Every hill revealed another hill behind it. Every morning brought a slightly different landscape. The farther west they traveled, the more unfamiliar everything became. At midday they stopped briefly. The men stretched their legs, some gathered water, others checked the animals. Lewis walked along the riverbank. He noticed a set of tracks in the mud. He crouched. The prints were small. He studied them carefully. A fox, perhaps. He followed them a short distance. They disappeared beneath a patch of grass. He smiled. There was always something to observe, even on an ordinary day. Especially on an ordinary day. Exploration was not made entirely from dramatic moments. Most of it was repetition: walking, paddling, cooking, waiting, repairing, measuring, recording, sleeping, then doing it again. The great stories of exploration often focused on danger, but the real journey was built from ordinary hours, thousands of them, quiet hours, long hours, sometimes boring hours, hours when nothing happened. And perhaps those were the hours that mattered most, because they gave the men time to understand the land, time to become accustomed to the river, time to notice the weather, time to learn each other's habits, time to become a small, moving community. By afternoon, the clouds had cleared. Sunlight spread across the river. The wet trees began drying. Steam seemed to rise from the ground. The men continued west. The river narrowed. Tall grasses appeared along the banks. A few birds flew low over the water. One of the men pointed toward the sky. A large bird circled high above them. Nobody knew exactly what the next day would bring, but the uncertainty no longer felt frightening. It had become part of life. That evening they stopped again. This time the camp was placed on slightly higher ground. The men had learned from the previous night's rain. They chose a dry area beneath several large trees. The horses were secured. The fire was built. Food was prepared. As darkness arrived, the camp became warm and familiar. Someone began telling a story. Another man interrupted with a joke. Several laughed. The sound drifted through the trees. Lewis sat beside the fire. He listened. For a moment, the expedition did not feel like an enormous historical journey. It simply felt like a group of tired men sitting beside a fire, far from home, far from their families, far from everything familiar. The firelight made their faces look softer. The shadows moved behind them. The smell of wood smoke filled the air. Lewis looked into the flames. He thought about home. He wondered what the people there were doing. Perhaps someone was preparing supper. Perhaps a child was falling asleep. Perhaps rain was tapping against a farmhouse window. Perhaps someone was sitting beside another small fire. The thought made him quiet. The frontier was enormous, but distance did not erase memory. Sometimes distance made memory stronger. Clark noticed Lewis staring into the fire. Thinking about home, Lewis nodded. Yes. Clark looked into the flames. So am I. Neither man said more. They did not need to. The fire continued burning. The men slowly became quieter. Night arrived again. But this night was different. The wind remained gentle. The insects sang. The river murmured. Everything seemed ordinary, comfortably ordinary. And after the previous night's silence, that ordinary sound felt reassuring. Lewis eventually returned to his notebook. He wrote beneath the firelight. The pages were becoming filled with observations, names, measurements, descriptions, small sketches, questions, ideas. The notebook was becoming a record of a world that few people in the United States had ever seen. But Lewis knew that paper could only capture part of what he experienced. A page could describe the size of a river. It could describe the color of a mountain. It could describe an animal. But how could a page describe the feeling of standing alone beneath a western sky? How could words explain the sound of wind moving through thousands of acres of grass? How could numbers describe the loneliness of a distant horizon? Some experiences resisted measurement. They simply remained in memory. The fire burned lower. The men prepared for sleep. One by one, they disappeared beneath their blankets. Clark remained awake for a while. He checked the animals. Then he walked once around the edge of camp. Nothing unusual. Returned to the fire, Lewis was still awake. "Everything quiet?" Lewis asked. "Everything quiet." Clark sat beside him. For a few minutes they listened. The night was full of small sounds, a cricket, a distant bird, the river, the occasional movement of a horse, the soft crackling of wood. Lewis looked at the fire. "Much better than last night," Clark smiled. "Perhaps the wilderness decided to let us sleep." Lewis laughed softly. "Let's hope so." Fire burned. The stars appeared above the trees. The sky was enormous. Thousands of stars stretched across it. Without city lights, the night sky seemed almost impossibly deep. The men had seen stars before, but out here they seemed different, closer, brighter, more numerous. The universe felt enormous, and the men felt very small. Perhaps that was one of the quiet lessons of the expedition. The wilderness did not care whether they were brave. It did not care whether they were important. It did not care whether their journey would someday become part of American history. The river continued. The seasons changed. The mountains remained. The stars appeared every night. The men were temporary visitors, and perhaps there was something peaceful in realizing that. The journey did not belong to them. They were simply passing through. Lewis finally closed his notebook. He placed it beside his bedding. Then he looked once more toward the fire. The flames moved slowly, orange light, black shadows, gray smoke. He breathed deeply. The air smelled of wet earth and wood. He could hear the river. He could hear the wind. He could hear the quiet breathing of the men around him. For the first time in many hours, his mind became still. He lay down. The blanket felt warm. The ground beneath him was hard but familiar. His eyes closed. The expedition continued outside his dreams. The river moved. The trees swayed. The stars crossed the sky. And the small fire slowly became smaller. Soon there was only a bed of glowing coals, then only a faint red light, then darkness. But the darkness was no longer mysterious. It was simply night. A natural part of the journey, a space between one day and another, a quiet pause before another morning. And somewhere beyond the sleeping camp, the Missouri continued carrying the explorers westward, slowly, patiently, beneath the stars, toward mountains they had never seen, toward rivers they had never crossed, toward people they had never met, toward a future they could not imagine. And for a few peaceful hours beneath the enormous American sky, Lewis, Clark, and the men of the expedition slept. The wilderness watched over them, not as a monster, not as a mystery, but simply as the vast, ancient land that had been there long before they arrived, and would remain long after they were gone. The river continued flowing, the stars continued shining, the fire continued fatting, and the night became quiet again, very quiet. But this time the silence felt peaceful. Morning came with a pale gray light. The camp was still quiet. For several minutes, nobody moved. The night had been peaceful, and the men seemed reluctant to leave the warmth of their blankets. Then a horse shifted, leather creaked, someone coughed. A few birds began calling from the trees. The day had begun. Clark opened his eyes and looked toward the sky. The stars were disappearing. The eastern horizon was turning silver. He sat up slowly and wrapped his coat around his shoulders. The air was cool. A thin layer of mist rested over the river. For a moment, the Missouri looked almost motionless. Clark watched it. The river had a way of making time feel slower. It did not hurry. It did not stop. It simply moved. The same was true of the expedition. Day after day, the men moved west, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, sometimes only a few miles. But always forward. Clark stood and walked toward the water. He knelt and washed his face. The cold river woke him completely. Behind him, the camp began coming alive. Someone was preparing breakfast. Someone else was collecting wood. A few men checked the boats. The horses were being fed. The ordinary work of morning had begun. Lewis appeared a short time later. He carried his notebook under one arm. "Morning," he said. "Morning." Lewis looked at the river. "Clear day." Clark nodded. "Looks like it." They stood together. The previous night's silence was no longer mentioned. There was no need. Whatever had caused it, the moment had passed, and the wilderness had already given them another morning. After breakfast, the expedition continued. The boats moved into the current. The men paddled. The river widened. The sun climbed. The temperature slowly increased. The landscape changed almost imperceptibly. At first, the trees along the river remained dense. Then the forest opened. Grasslands appeared. Golden fields stretched toward distant hills. The horizon seemed larger. The sky seemed larger too. There was a strange freedom in the open country. Nothing blocked the view. A man could see for miles. Yet the openness could also make the travelers feel very small. The expedition moved through a world that seemed to have no end. Lewis watched the hills. He had been studying the country for months, but he still found himself surprised by it. In the east, the land had seemed crowded settlements. Farms, roads, fences, buildings. Here there were long stretches where none of those things existed, only earth and sky. The men occasionally saw signs of people, an old trail, a fire pit, a few footprints, a distant village, evidence that the land was not empty. It simply belonged to communities whose lives were connected to the landscape, in ways the explorers were still learning to understand. Lewis knew that the expedition was not traveling through a vacant wilderness. They were traveling through the homelands of many native nations. Every river, every hunting ground, every trail had meaning. Every landscape had a history. The expedition could not fully understand all of it, but they were beginning to learn. That afternoon, they encountered a small group of native travelers. The men slowed the boats. The two groups watched each other from a distance. There was uncertainty, curiosity, caution. Then, slowly, the tension eased. Gestures were exchanged. A few words were spoken. Gifts were offered. The meeting was brief, but it reminded the explorers of something important. The country they were entering was not silent. It was filled with people, families, travelers, hunters, children, elders, communities, stories. The wilderness had its own human geography. The explorers were only beginning to see it. That evening they made camp near a grove of cottonwood trees. The ground was dry, the weather was clear. The men were tired, the fire was built quickly. Dinner was simple. There was no reason to make the evening complicated. The men ate, they talked. Then they prepared to sleep. Lewis sat beside the fire. He watched sparks rise into the darkness. One spark, then another. Each disappeared almost immediately. He thought about how similar their journey was. Each day appeared, each day disappeared. A memory remained, a note remained. A footprint remained for a while, then the wind or rain erased it. Perhaps that was why Lewis wrote so much. He wanted to preserve what the wilderness would eventually erase. The night became deeper. The moon appeared above the trees. The river reflected a narrow line of silver light. The camp was quiet, but this time the silence was not strange. It was comfortable. The men had learned something during their journey. Silence did not always mean danger. Sometimes silence simply meant rest. Sometimes the land was quiet because the animals were sleeping. Sometimes the wind stopped. Sometimes the river seemed to whisper. Sometimes nothing happened at all, and nothing happening could be a beautiful thing. Lewis leaned back. He listened to the night. A cricket chirped. Then another answered. A distant owl called. The river moved steadily. The fire cracked softly. He closed his eyes for a moment. The sounds blended together. It was almost like music, not music made by people, music made by the land. He opened his eyes again. Clark was sitting across from him, still awake. Yes, Clark smiled. Need the sleep. I know. Neither moved. They remained beside the fire. There was no urgency, no immediate danger, no difficult decision. Just a quiet night. The men had become accustomed to these moments. They were beginning to understand that a long journey was made from thousands of small pauses. Not every moment had to be important. Not every night needed a story. Sometimes it was enough to sit beside a fire, to feel the warmth, to listen to the river, to watch the stars. Eventually Clark stood. I'm turning in. Lewis nodded. Good night. Clark disappeared into the darkness of the camp. Lewis remained. He looked into the fire. The flames had become smaller. He added one final piece of wood. The flames rose. For a few moments the fire became bright again. The trees around him became visible. The men sleeping nearby, the packs, the equipment, the horses, everything seemed peaceful. Then the fire slowly settled. Lewis watched the flames collapse into glowing embers. He wondered how many more fires they would build, how many would burn beside rivers, how many beneath trees, how many under rain, how many under snow, perhaps hundreds, perhaps more. Each fire would be temporary, but each would mark a place in their journey. A small circle of warmth in an enormous landscape, a place where men rested before continuing, a place where stories were told, a place where memories were made. He finally stood, he checked the fire, then he looked toward the river. The moon was high now. The water moved quietly, he could hear nothing else. Lewis walked to his bedding, he lay down. The blanket covered his shoulders. His body was tired. His mind was beginning to slow. The last thing he heard before falling asleep was the river. It moved past the camp without interruption. It had been moving long before the expedition arrived, and it would continue moving after they were gone. Lewis closed his eyes. The sounds of the camp became distant. The fire became a faint warmth. The river became a steady rhythm. His breathing slowed and sleep came. Outside, the night continued. The stars moved slowly across the sky. The trees stood dark against the horizon. The horses rested. The men dreamed. And the river carried the reflection of the moon westward. Far ahead, the land rose. The first great mountains were still waiting. Beyond them lay an entirely different world. The expedition did not know what those mountains would demand from them. They did not know how difficult the journey would become. They did not know how much colder the nights could be. They did not know how difficult the rivers would become. They did not know how much they would depend on one another. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, they were simply travelers resting beside a river. And the wilderness was quiet, the kind of quiet that does not frighten you, the kind of quiet that allows the mind to let go, the kind of quiet that comes when the day's work is finished. The fire was almost gone. The river continued. The wind moved gently through the leaves, and beneath the enormous sky the expedition slept. Hours passed. Then the first light of another morning began to appear. Again the darkness slowly faded. Again the birds began singing. Again the horses moved. Again the men would wake. And again they would move west, because that was the rhythm of the expedition: sleep, wake, travel, rest, repeat. A long road made from ordinary days, and somewhere within those ordinary days were the moments that would become history. But for the men living them, they were simply days: another sunrise, another river, another fire, another night, and another quiet step into the unknown. The next morning began beneath a clear sky. The rain had disappeared completely. Only the damp earth remained to remind the men of the storm that had passed. Mist hovered over the Missouri River, thin and pale, drifting slowly between the trees. For a while the camp seemed suspended between night and day. The men moved quietly. Nobody spoke loudly. There was no reason to. The morning itself seemed to ask for silence. Lewis stood near the river with his coat pulled tightly around him. He watched the mist. The world beyond the water was almost invisible. Trees appeared and disappeared inside the pale haze. A bird called somewhere in the distance. Then another answered. Lewis listened. He had begun to recognize some of the sounds of the western country. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough to know that the land was speaking constantly. The challenge was learning how to listen. Behind him, Clark was already preparing for the day's work. The men checked the boats. They inspected ropes. They counted supplies. They examined the horses. Nothing about the morning suggested danger. It was simply another day on the long road west. After breakfast, the expedition moved again. The river carried them through a wide valley. The banks were lined with tall grass. Beyond the grass rose low hills. The hills were covered with scattered trees. Farther away, the horizon disappeared into a faint blue haze. The men traveled quietly. Paddles moved, water splashed, wood creaked. Occasionally someone spoke. Then the rhythm returned: paddle, pull, lift, paddle, pull, lift. It was a sound that could almost become a lullaby. Lewis found himself staring at the water. The movement was repetitive, hypnotic. The river never seemed to hurry. It was always going somewhere. He wondered whether people were like rivers. Perhaps they spent much of their lives moving without fully understanding where they were going. The expedition had a destination, but none of the men truly knew what awaited them there. They had maps, instructions, supplies, knowledge, but certainty was impossible. That was the nature of exploration. You could prepare, you could plan, you could study. But eventually you had to leave the map behind. At midday, the men stopped beside a sandy bank. The horses were given water. The men ate, some rested beneath the shade. Lewis walked away from the group. He found a flat stone near the water. He sat there. The river flowed in front of him. He took out his notebook. For several minutes he did not write. He simply watched. A small insect landed on the surface of the water. The current carried it away. A leaf followed, then a small branch. All of them moved west. Everything seemed to become part of the river. Lewis finally began writing. He recorded observations about the land, the weather, the river, the vegetation. But beneath those practical notes he carried another thought. The journey was changing him. The wilderness was teaching patience. At home, silence might have meant loneliness. Here, silence meant awareness. At home, darkness might have meant the end of the day. Here, darkness was another landscape. It had its own sounds, its own movement, its own character. The men were learning to live with uncertainty. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of the expedition, not how to cross a continent, but how to remain calm when you did not know what came next. The men eventually returned to the boats. The journey continued. The afternoon became warmer. The sun moved slowly across the sky. Clouds gathered in the distance. For a while, Lewis watched them carefully. He remembered the silent night. He wondered whether another storm might arrive. But the clouds passed without bringing rain. The evening came gently. The expedition found a place to camp near a small creek. The water was clear, the ground was dry. There was plenty of wood nearby. The men decided to remain there for the night. A fire was built, dinner was prepared. As darkness fell, the camp became familiar. A small circle of light appeared beneath the trees. Outside that circle, the wilderness disappeared. It was the same feeling as before. The men could see only a little. Everything beyond the fire was hidden. But now they understood. The darkness did not need to be conquered. It simply needed to be accepted. Lewis sat beside the fire. Clark sat nearby. Neither man spoke. The men around them were slowly becoming quieter. One by one, they disappeared into their blankets. The fire burned. The creek moved. The trees whispered. Lewis looked up. The stars were beginning to appear, one, then another, then hundreds. The sky seemed endless. He thought again about home, about roads, about familiar buildings, about people who had never seen a landscape like this. He wondered what they would think if they could stand here. Would they be afraid? Would they feel free? Would they feel very small? Perhaps all three. The wilderness had a way of creating several feelings at once: fear and peace, loneliness and freedom, uncertainty and wonder. The men had learned that these feelings could exist together. Clark finally spoke. "Do you think we'll remember these nights?" Lewis looked at him. "Years from now?" "Yes," Lewis thought about it. "I think we will," Clark nodded. "The quiet ones, especially the quiet ones." Clark smiled, then he looked into the fire. The two men remained silent. The question stayed with them. Years later, perhaps they would remember the mountains, the rivers, the difficult crossings, the meetings, the storms. But perhaps they would also remember the nights when nothing happened. The nights when they sat beside a fire and listened to the river. The nights when the world seemed impossibly large. The nights when the only light came from burning wood. Those moments might become more precious with time, because ordinary peace was difficult to appreciate while it was happening. Only later did people understand how valuable it had been. The fire began to collapse. A log shifted, flames rose briefly, then settled. Lewis added another piece of wood. The fire brightened. For a few moments, the faces of the men became visible again. Some were already asleep. One man smiled in his sleep. Another turned beneath his blanket. The horses stood quietly. Everything seemed safe. Then Lewis heard something, a distant sound. He looked up. Clark noticed. "What is it?" Lewis listened. Nothing. He waited. Again there was a sound, very faint, almost impossible to identify. A low rustling somewhere beyond the creek. Clark leaned forward. The two men listened. The sound stopped. They waited. Nothing. Lewis smiled. "Probably the wind." Clark nodded. "Probably." The word again, probably. Neither man moved. After a few moments the sound returned. This time it was softer, like grass brushing against grass. They waited. A small animal appeared near the creek. It stopped, looked toward the fire, then disappeared. Clark laughed quietly. "Another mysterious visitor." Lewis smiled. "Perhaps the wilderness is getting used to us." Tension disappeared. They returned their attention to the fire. The night continued. Nothing else happened. And that was perhaps the most comforting ending possible. No danger, no dramatic discovery. No sudden attack, only a quiet night, a fire, a river, a sleeping camp, the simple rhythm of life on the trail. Lewis finally closed his eyes, the warmth of the fire reached his face. The sound of the creek became softer, the voices of the men faded, his breathing slowed, the darkness became gentle. And once again sleep found him far above the camp. The stars continued moving. The moon crossed the sky, the creek continued toward the Missouri continued west, and the expedition rested. Tomorrow there would be another journey, another landscape, another river bend, another hill, another unknown place. But tonight there was nothing to solve, nothing to fear, nothing to understand. The men could simply rest. And sometimes after traveling so far, rest was the greatest discovery of all. The fire became smaller, the glowing coals turned red, then dark. The last thread of smoke disappeared into the night. The campfire had gone silent. But this time the silence did not feel mysterious. It felt like sleep. And beneath the vast American sky, the explorers dreamed quietly of whatever waited beyond the morning. Morning returned softly. There was no alarm, no shouting, no sudden movement, only the gradual return of light. The eastern sky became pale and the darkness slowly lifted from the trees. The men woke one by one. Some remained still for a few moments, listening to the morning. The creek was flowing nearby. Birds were calling. The horses were moving through the grass. Someone stirred the ashes of the previous night's fire. A small flame appeared. Then another. Soon smoke rose between the trees. The campfire had returned. It was always remarkable how quickly a cold circle of ash could become a source of warmth again. A few pieces of dry wood, a little patience, a small flame, and suddenly there was light. Lewis watched the fire being rebuilt. He thought about the journey. Perhaps life on the trail was like that. Something could seem finished at night. Then morning came. A new fire. A new day. Another chance to continue. After breakfast, the expedition packed its belongings. The camp disappeared once again. The men had become efficient at leaving. Nothing unnecessary remained behind. The horses were prepared. The boats were loaded. The last pieces of equipment were checked. Then they moved toward the river. Lewis walked behind the others for a moment. He looked back. The place where they had slept was already difficult to recognize. The grass had been disturbed. A few footprints remained. There were traces of ash. But soon even those would disappear. He realized that the expedition was constantly leaving places behind. The men did not build houses. They did not construct roads. They did not create permanent settlements. They passed through. The land remained. That thought gave him a strange sense of humility. They were travelers, nothing more. The river accepted them. The wilderness surrounded them, and time carried them forward. The boats entered the water. The men began paddling. The morning was cool. The sky was bright. The current was steady. For several hours the journey was peaceful. They passed through narrow sections of river, then wider ones. They moved beneath overhanging trees. They crossed open water. The landscape seemed endless. Lewis occasionally raised his head toward the distant horizon. There was something beyond it, something they had not yet seen. The Rocky Mountains were still ahead. At this point in the journey they had only heard descriptions. They knew the mountains would be large. They knew they would be difficult. But knowing something intellectually was different from seeing it. A mountain could be described with words, tall, steep, snow-covered, massive, but no description could fully prepare a person for the first sight. Lewis wondered when that moment would come, perhaps tomorrow, perhaps weeks from now, perhaps after many more bends in the river. Until then the expedition continued. At midday the men stopped near a meadow. The sun was warm. The grass moved gently in the wind. Several men lay down beneath the shade. For a short while the expedition was almost motionless. Lewis sat beneath a tree. He opened his notebook. But instead of writing immediately, he watched the meadow. A few insects moved through the grass. A bird landed on a branch. Far away, a herd of animals moved slowly across the open country. Everything seemed peaceful. Lewis thought about how much of the expedition was spent simply watching the weather, watching the river, watching animals, watching people, watching the land. Exploration required attention. The land was constantly changing. Sometimes the changes were obvious. A storm, a flood, a mountain. Other times they were almost invisible. A shift in vegetation, a change in soil, a new animal track, a different sound, a new smell in the air. The men learned to notice these things. The longer they traveled, the more familiar the unfamiliar became. After the midday rest, they continued. The afternoon passed quietly. Then, near sunset, the landscape began to change. The hills grew larger, the river narrowed. Rock appeared along the banks. The men became more alert. They had entered rougher country. The current was stronger. The boats moved differently. The river seemed to push against them. Clark studied the water carefully. He gave instructions to the men. Paddles moved more quickly. The boats turned. They passed between rocks. Then the river opened again. Everyone relaxed. A few men laughed. The danger had been small. But the experience reminded them that the river could change without warning. By evening, they found a safe place to camp. The men were tired. They built a fire. The sky was clear. Stars appeared almost immediately. The night air was colder than the previous evenings. Lewis wrapped himself in his coat. He looked toward the western horizon. There was something about the air, a faint smell of stone and dry grass. The land seemed different, older, rougher. The expedition was moving into a new region. The familiar river landscape was slowly giving way to something else. Lewis wondered whether the mountains were closer than they realized. Perhaps the horizon was hiding them. The thought made him smile. The unknown was no longer frightening. It was becoming exciting. But even excitement had to wait. The men needed sleep. The fire burned quietly. The stars became brighter. The camp became silent. Lewis listened. There was no strange sound tonight. No sudden movement. No unexplained silence. Only the natural sounds of the wilderness. He heard the river, the wind, the insects, the horses. He smiled. Perhaps the quiet night had finally become ordinary. He lay down. The blanket was cold at first. Then his body warmed it. He closed his eyes. The sounds of the wilderness became distant. His thoughts drifted. He imagined the mountain. He imagined the other side of them. What would they find? Another river, more forests, open country, different people, perhaps a vast ocean. Nobody knew. The uncertainty remained. But for now, it was enough simply to imagine. The fire crackled. The night deepened. One by one, the men fell asleep. The camp became still. The stars moved slowly. The river continued. And far away, beyond the darkness, the mountains waited. They had been waiting long before the expedition began. They would remain long after it ended. The explorers were only approaching slowly, quietly. One day at a time, the night passed. Hours later, a cold breeze moved through the camp. One man woke briefly. He looked toward the fire. The coals were still glowing. He pulled his blanket tighter, then closed his eyes again. Nothing happened. The night continued peacefully. And in the distance, the first outline of a mountain became visible beneath the stars. Not clearly, not enough to understand. Just a dark shape against the darker sky. The wilderness was beginning to reveal what lay ahead. But morning would have to come first. For now, the men slept. The river whispered beside them. The wind moved softly through the grass. And the small fire continued glowing in the darkness, a final circle of warmth, a quiet reminder that even in the vast unknown there could still be a place to rest. The fire slowly faded, the stars remained, the night grew deeper, and somewhere between waking and dreaming the expedition moved forward without moving at all for a few hours. The journey could pause, the mountains could wait, the river could wait, the unknown could wait. Sleep came first. And beneath the enormous western sky, the explorers rested quietly until another dawn. Dawn came colder than before. The first light touched the tops of the distant hills, but the valley remained in shadow. A thin layer of frost covered the grass. The men woke slowly, breathing pale clouds into the morning air. For a few moments, nobody spoke. The campfire had burned down during the night, leaving only a bed of gray ash and a few faintly glowing pieces of wood. One of the men crouched beside it and began rebuilding the fire. Dry grass, small twigs, then larger pieces of wood, a breath of air. A tiny flame appeared. The flame grew, smoke rose, warmth returned. It was a simple process, but after a cold night it felt almost magical. Lewis stood near the edge of camp. He looked toward the horizon. The mountains were still there. Now they could be seen more clearly. Dark shapes rose behind the distant hills. At first they seemed like clouds. Then the light changed. The outlines became sharper. Lewis stared. He had seen mountains before, but these were different. They seemed to stretch beyond the limits of the landscape. Clark joined him. For several seconds neither man spoke. Finally Clark said, "There they are." Lewis nodded. Yes, the words were quiet. The moment did not require anything more. The men had been traveling toward these mountains without seeing them. Now they were finally visible. They looked enormous, and they were still far away. The sight changed the mood of the camp. The men became more alert, some were excited, others were uneasy. The mountains represented another stage of the journey. The river would eventually lead them into more difficult country. The comfortable rhythm of paddling would change, the terrain would become rough, the weather could become colder, food could become harder to find. The men knew this. But they also knew that the mountains were part of their mission. They had come this far, they could not turn around now. Breakfast was prepared. The men ate quickly. The boats were checked. The animals were secured. Then the expedition began moving again. The river carried them toward the mountains. As the morning progressed, the distant peaks became larger, the landscape changed, trees grew shorter, grass became thinner, rock appeared more frequently. The river moved between higher banks. The men became increasingly quiet. There was something about approaching mountains that made conversation seem unnecessary. Everyone was watching. Everyone was thinking. The world ahead was beginning to reveal itself. Lewis kept looking toward the peaks. Snow remained visible on some of them. Even though the day was warm, the snow did not disappear. It remained high above them, white against blue, a reminder of the cold world that waited higher up. By afternoon, the men reached a section of river where the current became difficult. The boats moved slowly. The men worked harder. Paddles entered the water again and again. Their arms became tired. But the mountains seemed closer. That gave them strength. Every difficult mile meant another mile completed. Every bend brought them nearer. At one point, Lewis stepped out of the boat. He walked along the riverbank. The ground was rocky. He noticed several unfamiliar plants growing between the stones. He carefully examined them. He had always been interested in the natural world. Plants were not simply decoration. They were clues. They told him about the soil, the climate, the altitude, the region, the changing environment. He wrote several notes. Then he continued walking. Above him, a bird circled. It moved effortlessly through the air. Lewis watched it for a moment. He wished he could travel that way, without rivers, without mountains, without heavy equipment, just wings and wind. Then he smiled at the thought. Explorers were always imagining easier ways forward. But the journey had to be made step by step. That evening, the expedition stopped near a rocky bank. The men built a small fire. The mountains were visible even after sunset. Their outlines became dark against the fading sky. The men sat quietly. Nobody joked as much as usual. They were thinking about the road ahead. Clark studied the map. Lewis sat beside him. The map looked small compared with the country around them. A few lines, a few marks, names, measurements. The real landscape was much larger. Mountains could not be fully captured on paper. Neither could rivers. Neither could distance. Neither could the feeling of standing at the edge of a world that seemed to have no end. Clark folded the map. Tomorrow will be different. Lewis nodded. I think so. Fire burned between them. A soft wind moved through the grass. The stars appeared. The mountains became silhouettes. The men prepared for sleep. One by one, they wrapped themselves in blankets. The camp became quiet. Lewis remained awake a little longer. He watched the fire. He thought about the previous silent night. It seemed strange now. The mystery had been so small. The silence had been caused by weather, nothing more. Yet that moment had stayed with him. Perhaps because it reminded him how little they truly understood about the country. Even when there was a simple explanation, the feeling of uncertainty remained. And perhaps that was what made the journey meaningful. They were not simply traveling through unknown land. They were learning how little they knew. Lewis added another piece of wood to the fire. The flame rose, then settled. He looked at the sleeping men. They were exhausted. Their clothes were worn. Their boots were damaged. Their faces were darker from the sun. But they had continued, day after day. They had become accustomed to hardship. They had become a team. The expedition was no longer just a group of people following orders. It had become a small traveling community. Each man depended on the others. A boat needed several hands. A difficult crossing required cooperation. Food had to be shared. Firewood had to be gathered. Animals had to be cared for. When someone was sick or injured, everyone was affected. Their survival was connected. Lewis understood that more clearly than ever. The fire burned lower. He finally lay down. The ground was hard beneath him. The night air was cold, but the blanket was warm. He closed his eyes. The mountains disappeared from his mind. The river became a distant sound. His breathing slowed. The world became quiet, not frightening, not mysterious, simply quiet. Sleep came. and while the men slept, the mountains remained dark against the stars. The wind moved slowly through the valley. A few clouds passed over the moon. The horses shifted occasionally. The fire became smaller, smaller, until only a faint glow remained. Then even that disappeared. The campfire went silent. But the mountains did not. They waited patiently, silently. Tomorrow the expedition would begin moving toward them. Tomorrow the river would carry the men closer. Tomorrow the familiar world would begin to disappear behind them. But tonight none of that mattered. Tonight the men were allowed to rest. Their journey could wait until morning. The mountains could wait. The unknown could wait. The entire western horizon could wait. For now there was only darkness, only stars, only the distant sound of water, and the slow, peaceful breathing of tired travelers sleeping beneath an enormous sky. Hours passed. The night deepened. The moon moved westward. The stars shifted. The cold grew stronger. Then, sometime before dawn, snow began falling high in the mountains. The flakes were too far away for the sleeping men to see. But the mountains were already changing. A new weather system was moving toward the valley. And when morning came, the expedition would discover that the journey ahead was about to become much more difficult. For now, however, the men slept peacefully. The fire was gone. The darkness was complete. And the silent mountain stood beyond the camp, waiting for the first light of another day. The first light of morning appeared behind the mountains. It came slowly. At first, the eastern sky was only a little lighter than the rest of the darkness. Then a pale silver glow spread across the horizon. The men began to wake. The cold was the first thing they noticed. It had become much colder during the night. The grass was covered with frost. The wooden equipment felt hard and cold beneath their hands. The horses breathed clouds of white vapor. One of the men pulled his coat tightly around himself. Cold morning. Another man nodded. Very. Nobody complained for long. The fire needed to be rebuilt. Warmth was more important than conversation. Soon a small flame appeared among the ashes. The men gathered around it. The warmth slowly returned to their hands. Lewis stood a short distance away, looking toward the mountains. Something had changed. The peaks were brighter. Fresh snow covered their upper slopes. The white snow caught the morning light and seemed almost golden. The mountains looked closer than they had the previous evening. Perhaps it was only the clear air. Perhaps the weather had changed the way they appeared. Either way, the sight made the men quiet. They were approaching the great western mountains. There was no longer any doubt. The journey ahead would be difficult. Lewis returned to camp. Breakfast was prepared. The men ate quickly. They had learned not to waste time on cold mornings. Every task had a purpose. Every movement needed to be efficient. The boats were prepared. Supplies were checked. Animals were secured. Then the expedition moved again. The river was narrower here. The current moved faster. Large stones appeared beneath the surface. The men had to guide the boats carefully. The mountains grew larger. Their slopes filled more of the horizon. The landscape felt different. The air was thinner. The vegetation changed. The riverbanks became steeper. The men watched everything. Nobody wanted to make a careless mistake. At midday, clouds appeared over the mountains. They moved slowly at first, then faster. The sunlight disappeared. The temperature dropped. Clark looked toward the peaks. We may have weather coming. Lewis nodded. The men continued. They had little choice. The journey could not stop simply because clouds appeared. But they began searching for a better place to camp. The river turned. A narrow valley opened ahead. Tall cliffs rose on both sides. The sound of the water echoed between them. The men paddled slowly. The place felt strangely isolated. The cliffs blocked the wider horizon. For a while it seemed as though the entire world had narrowed to the river and the stone walls around it. Lewis looked upward. The cliffs disappeared into cloud. He could not see the tops. A few drops of rain touched the water. Then another. Then several more. The men worked faster. They needed shelter. Soon they found a small, flat area beneath a group of trees. The boats were pulled onto the shore. The men moved quickly. Tents were secured. Blankets were protected. Supplies were covered. The fire was built beneath the trees. Rain began falling steadily. The mountains disappeared behind clouds. The world became gray. The men gathered close together. For several hours they could do little, so they waited. Waiting was another part of exploration. Not everything could be controlled. Sometimes the best decision was simply to remain still. The rain continued. Water ran down the rocks. The river became darker. The fire hissed whenever a drop reached it. The men spoke quietly, some repaired clothing, others checked equipment. Lewis sat near the fire with his notebook. He could not write much. The damp air made the pages difficult to handle, so he simply watched the rain. It was peaceful, even in the mountains, perhaps especially in the mountains. Rain had a way of making the world smaller. The cliffs disappeared. The distant horizon vanished. Everything became close. The sound of water filled the air, rain on leaves, rain on rocks, rain on the river, rain on canvas. It became a single continuous sound, almost like the entire wilderness was breathing. Lewis leaned back. His eyes became heavy. He listened. The men around him grew quieter. Even the horses seemed calmer. There was nothing to do, so they rested. Hours passed. The rain eventually weakened. The clouds lifted slightly. A narrow beam of sunlight appeared between the mountains. The river reflected it. For a few moments, the valley looked almost magical. Then the light disappeared again. Evening arrived. The rain had cooled the air. The men prepared a simple meal. They ate quietly. The fire was rebuilt. The warmth felt wonderful. Outside the circle of light, the valley was already dark. The mountains were invisible again. Only their presence could be felt. Lewis sat close to the fire. He thought about the silent night from earlier in the journey. Compared with that night, this one was filled with sound. Rain, water, wind, rock, yet somehow the mountains felt even quieter. It was a different kind of silence. A silence created by enormous things, the cliffs, the clouds, the distance, the unknown. Lewis looked into the flames. He understood why people sometimes felt small in nature. The mountains did not seem hostile. They simply seemed indifferent. They had existed for ages. The men would pass through. The mountains would remain. The thought was strangely comforting. The world did not depend on them. They did not have to control everything. They only had to continue, one careful step, one careful decision, one day at a time. The men began preparing for sleep. The fire burned brightly. The rain had stopped. The clouds were moving away. Above the valley, stars slowly appeared. The mountains remained dark. Lewis looked up. He could see a few stars between the clouds. He wondered what the sky would look like from the top of the mountains. Perhaps the horizon would stretch forever. Perhaps they would see another world beyond. He would have to wait. The journey demanded patience. Lewis lay down. The blanket was warm. The fire was close enough to provide heat. The river made a steady sound nearby. He closed his eyes. The men around him settled into sleep. A few horses moved quietly. Then everything became still. The fire burned. The mountains stood. The river continued. And the night returned. But this night carried something different, a sense of approaching change. The expedition had reached the edge of another world. The easy river journey was slowly coming to an end. Ahead were mountains, steep trails, cold nights, difficult crossings, and questions that no map could answer. Yet for this one night, the men could forget all of that. They could sleep. The fire remained between them and the darkness. The mountains watched from beyond the trees. The stars appeared one by one. And the river whispered through the valley. Lewis drifted toward sleep. His thoughts became slower. The mountains became distant. The fire became softer. The river became a rhythm. He breathed deeply. The wilderness seemed to breathe with him, in and out, slowly, quietly, peacefully. Then sleep came. And the night passed. Near midnight, the fire collapsed slightly. A glowing log rolled toward the edge. One of the men woke. He reached out and pushed it back with a stick. The flames rose again. He looked around. Everyone else was asleep. He listened. Nothing, only the river, only the wind. Only the mountains. He smiled faintly. Then he returned to his blanket. The fire continued burning. The hours passed. The cold deepened. But the men remained warm. And before dawn, the clouds finally disappeared. Above the mountains, the sky became completely clear. Thousands of stars filled the darkness. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a pale river of light. The mountains stood beneath it, silent, ancient, unmoving. And somewhere below them, beside the narrow river, a small group of explorers slept beside their fatting fire. They had no idea what the next day would bring. They did not know how difficult the mountains would be. They did not know how far they still had to travel. But they had learned something during the journey. The unknown did not have to be faced all at once. Tomorrow could take care of tomorrow. Tonight belonged to sleep. So the men rested. The fire glowed. The river moved. The mountains waited. And beneath the endless western stars, the expedition slept peacefully until morning. Morning arrived beneath a sky so clear that the mountains seemed almost impossibly close. The last stars disappeared one by one. A faint golden light touched the highest peaks. Fresh snow reflected the sunrise. For a few quiet minutes, the mountains appeared almost unreal. Then the sunlight moved lower. The cliffs became visible. The trees became green again. The river turned silver, and the small camp beside the water slowly awakened. The men had slept well. Perhaps it was the sound of the river. Perhaps the clear night. Perhaps simple exhaustion. Whatever the reason, they rose with more energy than they had expected. The fire was still alive. A few glowing coals remained beneath the ash. One of the men added dry wood. Flames appeared. Another morning began. Lewis stood near the fire, holding a cup of warm water. He looked toward the mountains. There was no mist now, no rain, no clouds. Nothing separated them from the enormous peaks ahead. He studied them for a long time. The mountains seemed to rise from the earth itself. Their slopes disappeared into distance. Some peaks were bright with snow, others were dark and rocky. Between them were valleys that nobody in the expedition had yet explored. Lewis felt a mixture of curiosity and caution. The river had brought them this far. But the river would not make the journey easy forever. Soon they would have to leave the comfortable path of the water. Soon their feet would carry them where boats could not. That thought stayed with him. The men packed after breakfast. There was less conversation than usual. Everyone understood that the next part of the expedition would be different. The boats moved forward, the river narrowed. The current became stronger. The men had to guide the boats around rocks. At times they pushed against the riverbank. At other times they pulled the boats through shallow water. The work became slower. The mountains grew larger. Hours passed. The sun climbed. The men continued. Eventually they reached a place where the river was no longer easy to navigate. A series of rapids stretched ahead. Water rushed over rocks. White foam appeared. The sound echoed through the valley. Clark studied the route. The men pulled the boats onto shore. They would have to move carefully. Some equipment was carried by hand. Some supplies were transferred. The animals were brought forward. The expedition slowed almost to a walk. This was one of the first moments when the mountains truly announced themselves. They were no longer a distant view. They were part of every decision: where to walk, where to camp, where to cross, where to find food, where to find water, where to move the animals. The land itself had become an obstacle. Yet there was beauty everywhere. Waterfalls dropped from high cliffs. Mountain flowers grew between rocks. Eagles circled above the valley. Snow remained on distant slopes. The air was clear and cold. Lewis stopped several times to observe plants. He collected small samples. He made notes. He sketched. Even when the journey became difficult, his curiosity remained. Perhaps that was one reason he could endure the hardship. He was not only traveling, he was discovering. Every new plant was a question. Every unfamiliar animal was a question. Every mountain was a question. The expedition was moving through a world that had not yet been described in the way they understood description. They were attempting to give names and measurements to places that had existed for thousands of years without needing them. That afternoon, the men found a small meadow beside the river. They stopped to rest. The horses grazed. The men drank water. Some sat beneath the shade. Lewis walked away from the group. He looked toward the mountains. For the first time, he noticed how quiet they were. The river was loud. The birds were loud. The wind was moving. Yet the mountains themselves seemed silent. They did not move. They did not speak. They simply stood. He wondered how many storms had passed over them. How many winters. How many summers. How many generations of people had watched the same peaks change color beneath the sunrise. The thought made him feel very small, but it also made him calm. There was something reassuring about the permanence of the mountains. The expedition would eventually end. The men would return home. Their lives would change. Years would pass. But the mountains would remain. Lewis returned to the camp. The journey continued. By late afternoon, the weather changed. Clouds began forming above the peaks. The temperature dropped. A wind moved through the valley. The men looked toward the sky. They had learned not to ignore mountain weather. It could change quickly. Clark ordered the men to prepare an early camp. They found a sheltered area beneath a rocky overhang. The place was not perfect, but it would protect them from the wind. The horses were secured. Supplies were covered. The fire was built. Soon the first drops of rain began falling. The men gathered beneath the shelter. The rain became heavier. Water ran down the rocks. The fire hissed. The sound filled the valley. Lewis sat near the edge of the shelter. He watched the rain. The mountains disappeared again. Everything beyond the shelter became gray. The world seemed reduced to a small circle of dry ground. The men, the fire, the supplies, the horses, the rain. It reminded Lewis of the silent campfire from earlier. There was always a moment during travel when the outside world disappeared. Sometimes it happened at night, sometimes in fog, sometimes in rain, sometimes inside a mountain valley. And in those moments, the men became aware of how dependent they were on one another. They could not control the weather. They could not move the mountains. They could not stop the river. They could only prepare, then wait. The rain continued for hours. The men ate quietly. A few repaired their clothing. Someone sharpened a knife. Another checked a rope. There was very little conversation. The sound of rain made talking feel unnecessary. Eventually, evening came. The rain softened. The clouds lifted. The mountains slowly returned. Dark shapes emerged from the mist. Then the highest peaks appeared. The sky became purple. The wet rocks reflected the fading light. The valley looked completely different. Lewis watched the mountains emerge from the clouds. He understood why people told stories about mountains. They seemed almost alive, not because they moved, but because their appearance changed with every hour. Morning snow, afternoon sunlight, evening shadow, night darkness. The same mountain could appear gentle one moment and enormous the next. The men prepared for sleep. The fire burned brighter. The air became colder. One of the men sat beside Lewis. "Do you think we'll make it across?" Lewis looked at the mountains. "Yes." Man smiled. "You sound certain." Lewis paused, then he said, "No, but I think we'll try." Man laughed softly. It was perhaps the most honest answer anyone could give. The expedition could not promise success. They could only promise effort. One more mile, one more river, one more hill, one more morning. That was how great journeys were completed, not by knowing the end, but by continuing. Night settled over the valley. The stars appeared. The mountains became dark again. The campfire was the only warm light. Lewis sat beside it for a long time. He listened to the men breathing. He listened to the wind. He listened to the river. The sounds blended together. The fire cracked softly. A spark rose, then vanished. Another appeared, then disappeared. Lewis thought about the silent campfire. He realized that a fire was never truly silent. Even when the flames disappeared, warmth remained for a while. Even when the light vanished, the memory of it remained. Perhaps journeys were the same. A person could leave a place, but the place did not completely disappear. It remained in memory. The river, the trees, the mountains, the smell of smoke, the sound of rain, the feeling of cold air, the quiet around the fire, all of it could remain long after the traveler had gone. Lewis finally stood. He checked the fire. Then he walked toward his blanket. He lay down. The ground was cold, but he was tired. His eyes closed. The fire continued burning beside him. The men slowly fell asleep. Outside the shelter, the wind moved through the valley. The mountains stood in darkness. The river continued its endless journey, and somewhere high above, snow began falling again. The flakes landed silently on the peaks, one by one, thousands upon thousands. No sound, no warning, only snow. By midnight, the mountains were covered in fresh white. The camp below remained warm. The fire continued to glow. The men slept peacefully. They did not know that the landscape around them was changing. They did not know that morning would bring another surprise. They did not know that the route ahead would soon become even more difficult. But they did not need to know. Sleep did not require answers. It only required rest. And so the explorers rested. The river whispered. The fire breathed. The mountains remained silent. The stars moved across the sky. And the night stretched peacefully toward morning, slowly, quietly, without hurry, just as the journey itself had taught them. One moment, then another, 1 mile, then another, one night, then another, until eventually, somewhere beyond the mountains, the long road would end. But not yet. For now, the campfire still glowed, and beneath the quiet western sky, the men slept. Morning came with snow, not a heavy snow, only a thin layer that covered the rocks and grass like a quiet blanket. The men woke to a world that looked unfamiliar. The mountains were white. The trees were white. Even the edges of the river carried a faint line of frost. For several moments, nobody spoke. They simply looked. The wilderness had changed overnight. Yesterday, the valley had been green and gray. Now it was silver and white. The fire was the warmest thing in the world. The men gathered around it. Hands were held close to the flames. Coats were pulled tightly around shoulders. The horses stood quietly, their breath rising in white clouds. Lewis walked to the edge of the shelter. He looked toward the mountains. Fresh snow covered the peaks. Some of the higher ridges had disappeared completely into cloud. He knew they could not remain here forever. The expedition had to continue. But the weather had given them a warning. The mountains were not going to make their journey easy. Breakfast was prepared. The men ate slowly. Nobody wanted to leave the warmth of the fire. Eventually, however, the work began. Equipment was packed. Blankets were folded. Supplies were checked. The animals were prepared. The boats were inspected. Then they began moving again. The river was cold. Its surface carried small pieces of ice. The men guided the boats carefully. The current was stronger now. Snow-covered rocks made the river more difficult to read. Clark stood near the front of one boat watching the water. He pointed toward a narrow passage. The men adjusted their course. The boat moved around a rock, then another. The water rushed past. For a moment, everyone was completely focused. No one spoke. The boat passed safely. A few men laughed with relief. Then the journey continued. The mountains were closer now. Their slopes rose sharply on both sides. The river seemed to disappear between them. The valley became narrow. The sky appeared smaller. Lewis looked upward. Snow fell lightly. Tiny flakes landed on his coat. He caught one in his hand. It disappeared almost immediately. He smiled. The wilderness was constantly changing. That was perhaps the only certainty. Nothing remained exactly the same. Rain became snow. River became ice. Grass became mud. Day became night. Summer became winter. The men themselves changed too. Their faces became leaner. Their clothes became worn. Their movements became more confident. They were learning how to survive in the country. By afternoon, the snow had stopped. The clouds lifted. Sunlight returned. The mountains appeared brighter. The men continued along the river. Eventually, they reached a place where the river became too shallow for the boats. The expedition stopped. Everyone understood what that meant. The boats could go no farther. The next stage would have to be made on foot. The men pulled the boats onto shore. They secured them carefully. Supplies were unloaded. Pack animals were prepared. The landscape ahead was rough. There were no easy paths, only slopes, rocks, trees, snow, and distant mountains. Lewis stood at the edge of the river. He looked back at the water. For months, the river had been their road. It had carried them through unknown country. It had been their guide, their source of water, their path. Now they had to leave it. The thought was strangely emotional. The men had become accustomed to the river. Its sound had followed them through countless nights. Now the sound would slowly disappear behind them. Lewis took one final look, then turned toward the mountains. The expedition began walking. The pace was slow. The terrain demanded attention. Every step had to be chosen carefully. The men carried supplies. The animals carried heavier loads. The trail climbed, then descended, then climbed again. The mountains seemed to grow larger with every mile. By late afternoon, the men were exhausted. They stopped near a small group of trees. The ground was uneven, but there was enough shelter to make camp. The fire was built. The men gathered around it. Nobody spoke much. They were too tired. The only sounds were the fire and the wind. Lewis sat with his back against a tree. He watched the flames. He thought about how far they had come. The journey had begun with a river. Now they were standing among mountains. The world behind them felt distant. The world ahead was hidden. Between the two was this small camp, this fire. This night, this moment, Lewis realized that perhaps this was what exploration truly meant. Not knowing, not controlling, simply standing between what had been and what had not yet happened. The fire burned, the men ate. Then one by one they prepared for sleep. The mountains were silent. The snow reflected the moonlight. The trees stood dark against the white ground. The air was cold, very cold. Lewis wrapped himself tightly in his blanket. He listened. The wilderness was quiet again. But this time the silence felt different. There was no mystery, no uncertainty. He knew why it was quiet. Snow covered the ground. The wind had stopped. The animals were hidden. The men were sleeping. The world was simply resting. Lewis closed his eyes. The fire crackled beside him. The sound was soft, steady, comforting. His breathing slowed. His thoughts became distant. The mountains faded. The journey faded. The cold faded. Only the fire remained. Then even the fire seemed distant. He drifted toward sleep. Hours passed. The moon moved across the sky. The fire became smaller. One of the men woke briefly. He looked at the coals. They were still glowing. He added a piece of wood. The flames rose. For a moment the camp became bright. The mountains appeared, the trees appeared, the sleeping men appeared, then the fire settled again. The man returned to his blanket, the night continued, nothing happened, no danger, no strange sound, no sudden movement, only the quiet rhythm of sleep, the fire, the snow, the mountains, the wind, the stars, and the slow breathing of tired travelers. Near dawn, the temperature dropped even further. The fire became a faint red glow. The snow continued covering the ground. The mountains remained silent. Then the first light appeared. Another day was coming, another difficult day, another unknown trail. But for a few final moments the men remained asleep. The journey could wait, the mountains could wait, the cold could wait, the future could wait. For now there was only rest. And beneath the vast American sky, the expedition slept beside its small dying fire. A tiny light in an enormous world, a temporary warmth in an ancient wilderness, a quiet moment between yesterday and tomorrow. And as the first sunlight touched the snowy peaks, the last ember of the campfire glowed softly. Then it disappeared. The fire went silent again, but the journey did not. The men would rise, they would pack their belongings, they would shoulder their burdens, they would look toward the mountains. And slowly, carefully, they would continue west. The men rose with the first light. The cold had settled deep into the valley during the night. Every breath appeared as a small cloud. The snow beneath their boots made a soft, dry sound as they moved around the camp. There was no river beside them now, only the faint sound of wind moving through the trees. For the first time in many months, the expedition had truly left the river behind. Lewis stood quietly for a moment. He looked back toward the valley. The Missouri was somewhere beyond the trees, hidden from view. Its presence could still be felt in his memory, the steady sound of water, the endless bends, the reflections of stars, the countless nights spent beside its banks. But ahead of him were mountains. There was no turning away. The men prepared their packs. Food was divided carefully. Equipment was checked. Blankets were rolled. Weapons were secured. Animals were loaded. Every unnecessary object was left behind. Weight mattered now. Every extra pound would have to be carried up the slopes. The expedition moved slowly. The trail climbed through a forest of tall trees. Snow covered the lower branches. The morning sunlight filtered through them in narrow golden beams. For a while the men walked without speaking. The sound of their footsteps became a rhythm. Step, crunch, step, crunch. The rhythm continued. Somewhere above them a bird called. The sound echoed between the trees. Then silence returned. Lewis looked upward. The mountains were hidden behind the forest. He could not see how far they still had to climb. The uncertainty was strangely peaceful. They did not need to know the entire route. They only needed to know the next step. That was something the expedition had learned many times. When a river became dangerous, they focused on the next bend. When a storm approached, they focused on finding shelter. When food became scarce, they focused on the next meal. When exhaustion came, they focused on the next mile. The entire journey could be overwhelming if considered all at once. But one day was manageable. 1 mile was manageable. 1 step was manageable, so they walked. By midday, the forest began thinning, the land opened. The men could finally see the mountains again. They were enormous. Snow-covered ridges stretched across the horizon. Some peaks seemed to touch the sky. The men stopped. Nobody spoke. The view was enough. Lewis felt something he could not easily explain. It was not fear. It was not excitement. It was something between the two, a feeling of standing before something much larger than himself. He took out his notebook. But for once he did not write immediately. He simply looked. The mountains seemed endless. Perhaps they were. Perhaps the world continued beyond them forever. Clark stood beside him. We'll have to cross those. Lewis smiled. Yes. Clark looked at the peaks again. That's a long way up. Lewis laughed softly. Then we'd better start. Men continued. The trail became steeper. The animals struggled. The men helped them over difficult sections. At times they had to stop. At other times they moved only a few hundred yards before resting. The air became colder, the wind stronger, the landscape more exposed. Trees became smaller, grass became sparse, rock became common. The world was changing with every step upward. By late afternoon the men reached a small plateau. They stopped there. Everyone was exhausted. The decision was made to camp. There was little wood. That meant the fire would have to be small. The men gathered what they could find: dry branches, dead grass. A few pieces of fallen wood. Soon a small flame appeared. It was not a large fire. It did not need to be. It only needed to provide enough warmth to make the night bearable. The men sat close together. The mountains surrounded them. The sunset was beautiful. The peaks turned orange, then pink, then purple. Finally, they became dark. The sky filled with stars. From this height, the stars seemed even brighter. The men looked upward. One man pointed. "There's more stars here than back home." Another replied, "Maybe there are just fewer clouds." Everyone laughed softly. It was a simple joke, but laughter felt good. Even in difficult conditions, people needed moments of normal life, a smile, a joke, a familiar memory, something that reminded them they were still human beings and not simply explorers. Dinner was simple. The men ate slowly. Then the conversation faded. The fire was small. The wind was cold. Sleep became necessary. Lewis looked toward the mountains. They were dark silhouettes beneath the stars. He wondered what the next day would bring. He wondered whether the route ahead would become easier. He doubted it. But he also knew that uncertainty was no longer surprising. The expedition had lived with uncertainty for months. They had learned to carry it like another piece of equipment. A constant companion. Lewis lay down. The ground was hard. The cold was intense. He pulled the blanket close. The fire burned nearby. He listened. There was almost complete silence. No river, no insects, no distant animal, only wind. The mountains created a vast emptiness around the camp. Lewis closed his eyes. The silence reminded him of the earlier night. The campfire had gone silent then. The wilderness had seemed mysterious. But now he understood something. The silence itself was not the important part. What mattered was how a person responded to it. Fear could fill silence. So could peace. The same night could feel dangerous to one person and comforting to another. Lewis listened again. The wind moved gently. His breathing became slower. The fire crackled. A few sparks rose, then vanished. He felt his body becoming heavier. His thoughts slowed. The mountains disappeared. The expedition disappeared. Only warmth remained. He slept. The night passed quietly. The stars moved overhead. The fire slowly weakened. At some point, snow began falling again. Soft flakes landed on the blankets. The men did not wake. The snow continued. The world became white. The small fire became smaller. Eventually, the flames disappeared. Only a few glowing embers remained. The mountains stood around them, silent, still, ancient, and the sleeping men lay beneath the snow-covered sky. The journey had become harder, but their determination had become stronger. They were moving towards something none of them could fully imagine. Beyond the mountains was another landscape, another river, another chapter of the journey. But tonight, there was no need to think about it. The future would come when it came. For now, the men slept. The cold air moved over the plateau. The stars continued shining. The snow continued falling. And beneath the enormous western sky, the final embers of the campfire slowly disappeared. The fire went silent. The wilderness remained. And somewhere far beyond the sleeping camp, morning was already beginning its long journey toward them. Morning arrived slowly on the mountain plateau. The snow had stopped during the night. A thin white layer covered everything. The sleeping men looked almost like shadows beneath their blankets. For several minutes, nobody moved. Then one man sat up. He brushed snow from his coat. He looked toward the remains of the fire. Only ash remained. He began rebuilding it. The work was slow. His fingers were stiff from cold. But eventually a small flame appeared. The others gathered around it. Warmth returned. The morning began. Lewis opened his eyes. For a moment, he did not remember where he was. Then he saw the mountains. He remembered. The expedition had climbed higher. The air was thinner. The landscape was colder, and the trail ahead remained unknown. He sat up and looked toward the fire. The flame was small but steady. He smiled. Even the smallest fire mattered in a place like this. Breakfast was prepared. The men ate what they had. Supplies were becoming more important now. Every piece of food had value. Every animal mattered. Every decision mattered. After breakfast, the men prepared to move. The mountains were still ahead, but something had changed. The route appeared to descend. The men noticed it first in the landscape. The slope was no longer rising. The distant horizon opened slightly. The thought gave everyone new energy. Perhaps the highest point was near. Perhaps they were about to cross the mountains. Nobody knew. They continued. The trail wound between rocks. Snow became deeper in some places. In others, the ground was dry. The animals struggled. The men helped them. They moved slowly. One step, then another. By midday, the landscape opened. The men stopped. Before them was a valley. A vast valley. It stretched between distant mountain ranges. The men stared. For the first time they could see beyond the mountains. There was another world on the other side, another landscape, another river system, another unknown horizon. Lewis felt something inside him change. They had crossed the Great Divide. The journey was not over, not even close, but the landscape ahead was different. The mountains behind them became part of the past. Ahead was a new road. The men stood quietly. Nobody needed to speak. The view said everything. After a while, Clark smiled. "We made it this far." Lewis nodded. "Yes. We're still going." Lewis looked toward the valley, still going. They began descending. The journey became easier in some ways. The trail was still difficult, but gravity helped. The animals moved more freely. The men walked faster as they descended. The air became warmer. Snow became less common. Trees returned. Grass appeared. The landscape changed again. It felt almost like moving through different seasons within a single day. Higher up, winter. Lower down, spring. The men marveled at it. Nature had no fixed borders. One environment slowly became another. By late afternoon, they reached a stream. The water was clear and cold. The men stopped. They drank. The animals drank. Everyone rested. Lewis knelt beside the stream. He watched the water move over small stones. It reminded him of the Missouri, different river, different place, but the same movement. Water always seemed to find a way forward, around rocks, between roots. Through narrow passages, down steep slopes. It never needed a map. Lewis smiled. Perhaps there was a lesson in that. The expedition had maps, but the river had none. And still it traveled. That evening they camped beside the stream. The fire was built. The men were tired, but the mood was lighter. They had crossed the mountains. They had reached the other side. The unknown remained. But they had proven something to themselves. They could continue. The night was warmer. The stars appeared. The men sat around the fire. For the first time in several days, they laughed more freely. Someone told a story from home. Another man remembered a meal he had not tasted in months. They talked about family, friends, horses, weather, old roads, small things. The conversation made the camp feel less distant from civilization. Lewis listened. He realized that home was not only a place. It was also memory. A person's home could travel with them. A remembered voice, a familiar face, a favorite meal, a road, a song. A childhood memory. All of these could survive thousands of miles. The fire burned warmly. The men became quieter. One by one they returned to their blankets. Lewis remained beside the fire. He looked at the valley. The mountains behind him were dark. Ahead was open country. He wondered how long it would take to reach the ocean. Nobody knew exactly. But the thought no longer seemed impossible. The journey had already crossed so much. They had followed the Missouri. They had crossed mountains. They had survived storms. They had traveled through unfamiliar lands. They had slept beneath countless skis. Perhaps the ocean was not as far away as it seemed. Lewis added another piece of wood. The fire rose. He watched the flames. The familiar pattern returned. Fire, darkness, firelight, shadow, warmth, cold. He thought about the first silent night. At that time, the darkness had seemed mysterious. Now he understood something. The wilderness had not changed. He had become more comfortable with uncertainty. He had learned that not every unexplained sound was dangerous. Not every silence meant trouble. Not every darkness hid something frightening. Sometimes the unknown was simply unknown. And that was enough. Lewis finally stood. He checked the fire. Then he looked toward the sleeping camp. Everything was peaceful. He lay down. The stream made a gentle sound nearby. It was almost like the river. The sound repeated continuously. Water moving over stones. Water moving forward. Water never stopping. Lewis closed his eyes. His breathing slowed. The fire warmed his face. The stream became a quiet rhythm. The valley became still and sleep came. The night passed. The fire slowly became smaller. The stars moved across the sky. The stream continued flowing. The mountain stood in darkness. Then near dawn, a breeze moved through the valley. The last flame disappeared. Only glowing embers remained. The campfire went silent. But now the silence was different. It was no longer the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of completion. One stage of the journey had ended. Another was beginning. The men slept. The valley waited. The mountains remained behind them. The road ahead stretched west. And somewhere beyond the distant horizon, the Pacific Ocean waited. The explorers did not know exactly when they would reach it. They did not know what difficulties remained. They did not know how many nights they would spend beside fires. But they knew one thing: they would continue, slowly, carefully, together, one day at a time, one river at a time, one mountain at a time, and one quiet night at a time. The morning light began spreading across the valley. The last stars disappeared. The sleeping men remained still for a few final moments. Then another day began, and the expedition moved west again. The morning light spread slowly across the valley. The men woke to warmer air. For the first time in several days, they did not wake beneath a sky filled with snow. The mountains remained behind them, pale in the distance. Ahead, the land opened. Wide valleys stretched toward the western horizon. The expedition had entered another world. Lewis stood quietly beside the stream. He listened to the water. It sounded familiar, different from the Missouri, but still water, still moving, still carrying the land forward. He knelt and washed his face. The cold water felt refreshing. When he stood, he looked toward the mountains one last time. They seemed smaller now, not because they had changed, because he had moved away from them. That thought stayed with him. Distance could change the way a person remembered something. A mountain that seemed enormous when standing beneath it could become a distant shape when viewed from miles away. Perhaps fear worked the same way. Things often seemed larger when they were close. The expedition began preparing for another day. The men packed their supplies. The animals were loaded. The fire was extinguished completely. Soon the camp disappeared. They walked west. The valley was broad and beautiful. Tall grass moved in the breeze. Small streams crossed their path. Birds flew overhead. The men noticed unfamiliar plants and animals. Every few miles, Lewis stopped to observe something. A flower, a track, a tree, a bird, a stone. The land seemed to offer something new everywhere they looked. The journey was still difficult. Their feet were tired. Their clothing was worn. Their food supplies had to be carefully managed. But there was a new feeling among the men. They were no longer wondering whether the mountains could be crossed. They had crossed them. The unknown had become something they could approach. Not because they knew what was ahead, but because they had learned how to move forward without knowing. That was perhaps the greatest lesson of the journey. Courage was not always the absence of fear. Sometimes courage was simply continuing. The expedition traveled for several days. Each night they built another fire. Each morning they watched it disappear. The rhythm became familiar: fire, sleep, morning, travel, fire again. Some nights were cold, some were warm, some were windy, some were completely still. One evening they camped beside a wide meadow. The sunset was beautiful. The sky turned gold, then orange, then purple. The men sat quietly. No one seemed interested in conversation. They were tired, but it was a comfortable tiredness, the kind that comes after a day of honest work. Lewis sat near the fire. He listened to the men breathing. The horses moved quietly in the grass. The meadow stretched into darkness. There was no strange sound, no mystery, no fear, only the natural rhythm of evening. Lewis looked at the fire. He remembered the first night when the campfire had gone silent. At the time, the silence had seemed important. Now he understood that it was only one small moment in a much larger journey. The real story was not the silence. The real story was everything that came after: the miles, the rivers, the mountains, the storms, the friendships, the uncertainty, the mornings, the nights, the countless fires, the countless times the men had chosen to continue. He realized that history was often remembered through dramatic moments, but lives were actually built from ordinary moments. A meal, a conversation, a walk, a cold morning, a quiet evening, a fire, a night of sleep. Those moments rarely appeared in history books, yet they were the moments the travelers actually lived. Lewis smiled. He understood that someday people might talk about the expedition. They might remember the great rivers, the mountains, the difficult crossings, the discoveries. Perhaps the quiet nights would matter too, because those nights were when the explorers were simply human, not heroes, not historical figures, just tired men sitting beside a fire, thinking about home, listening to the wilderness, waiting for morning. The fire burned lower. Clark joined Lewis. For a while they sat together. Neither spoke. Eventually Clark said, "We've come a long way." Lewis nodded. Farther than I imagined." Lewis looked toward the dark horizon. "And still farther to go." Clark smiled. "Always." They laughed softly. Then the camp became quiet. The men prepared for sleep. The night was clear. The stars were bright. The fire remained warm. Lewis lay beneath his blanket. He could hear the river-like sound of the nearby stream. The rhythm was gentle. It reminded him of home. He closed his eyes. The journey seemed distant. His body was tired. His mind was calm. The fire crackled softly. The wind moved through the grass. The horses rested. Sleep came easily. Hours passed. The fire became smaller. The stars moved overhead. The moon crossed the sky. Nothing disturbed the camp. Near dawn, the last flames disappeared. The fire became a bed of glowing embers. Then the embers faded. The campfire went silent, but the silence was peaceful. It did not ask questions. It did not demand attention. It simply existed. The same wilderness that had once seemed frightening now felt almost like a companion. The land had taught them. It had tested them. It had exhausted them. It had surprised them. And it had given them moments of beauty they would never forget. The first light appeared. Birds began singing. The men slowly woke. Another day waited, another road, another river, another horizon, and somewhere far beyond that horizon was the ocean. The expedition still had miles to travel, but the hardest uncertainty was behind them. They had learned how to continue. And sometimes that was enough. The men rose, the fire was gone. They packed their belongings. The animals were prepared. Then they started walking. Behind them stood the mountains. Ahead stretched the western land. The morning sun touched the grass. A gentle wind moved across the valley. The men walked quietly. No one knew exactly where the next night would find them. But they no longer needed to know. They had learned to trust the road, to trust the river, to trust one another. And perhaps most importantly, to trust the simple rhythm of the journey: morning, travel, evening, fire, rest. Then morning again. A journey was not completed in one great moment. It was completed through thousands of small decisions to keep moving. The expedition continued. The sun climbed, the valley brightened. The mountains became smaller behind them, the road stretched west. And as the men disappeared into the morning light, the old campsite remained behind. There was no fire now, no voices, no footprints that would last forever, only a little disturbed earth, a few ashes, and the quiet grass moving in the wind. Soon even those traces would disappear. The wilderness would return to its natural state. And that was perhaps the most fitting ending. The explorers had come through, they had rested, they had dreamed, they had moved on. The land remained, the river continued, the mountains stood, the sky changed, the seasons passed, and the memory of one small campfire became part of a much larger journey. A journey that began with uncertainty, a journey that crossed rivers and mountains, a journey filled with quiet nights and difficult mornings. A journey that reminded the men that even in the most unknown places, there could always be a small circle of warmth, a small fire, a quiet camp, a moment of peace. And when that fire finally went silent, the journey did not end. It simply moved forward, just as the river moved forward, just as the wind moved forward, just as time moved forward. And tonight, far away from that wilderness, you can let that same rhythm carry you. The river moving slowly, the wind passing through the trees. The fire glowing softly, the mountains resting beneath the stars. There is nothing you need to solve, nothing you need to remember, nothing you need to do. The journey can continue without you for a while. The explorers can walk into the distance. The river can keep moving. The mountains can remain where they are, and you can simply rest. Breathe slowly. Let the sounds of the night become softer. Let your thoughts become lighter. Imagine the small fire beside the river. Imagine the warmth on your face. Imagine the quiet wilderness beyond the circle of light. There is no danger here, only distance, only darkness, only stars. And somewhere far away, the Missouri continues its endless journey beneath the night sky. The campfire has gone silent, the wilderness remains, the mountains remain, the stars remain. And the night is peaceful, very peaceful. You can rest now. The journey will still be there in the morning. The road west continued beneath the morning sun. The men walked in a slow, steady rhythm. Nobody hurried. They had learned that there was little value in rushing through a journey this long. The land ahead was wide. The horizon seemed almost endless. Behind them, the mountains slowly disappeared. At first, they were still large enough to dominate the view, then they became distant shapes, then faint blue lines. Eventually, they were almost impossible to see. Lewis looked back one final time. He thought about the nights they had spent among those mountains, the cold, the snow, the small fires, the quiet, the uncertainty. He remembered waking beneath a sky filled with stars. He remembered the sound of wind moving through the rocks. He remembered the first moment when the mountains appeared. All of those memories had already become part of the journey. He turned forward. The road continued. The men traveled for several more days. The landscape gradually became warmer. The grass grew taller, trees became more common. The air felt different. The mountains were behind them. They were moving toward another great river. The expedition had entered a new region. Everything felt unfamiliar again. And yet, strangely, it also felt familiar. The men knew how to build a camp. They knew how to prepare food. They knew how to protect their supplies. They knew how to read the weather. They knew how to sleep beneath an open sky. The wilderness had taught them its language, not completely, but enough. One evening they stopped beside a quiet riverbank. The sun was low. The water reflected the sky. The men built a fire. This fire was larger than the fires they had made in the mountains. There was plenty of dry wood. The evening was warm. The men sat around it. Someone began telling a story. Another man laughed. The sound traveled across the river. Lewis listened. He looked around. The men were different now, not physically, but emotionally. The journey had changed them. They had become more patient, more observant, more comfortable with silence. They had learned to appreciate simple things: warm food, dry clothing, a safe place to sleep. A clear morning, a calm river, a small fire. Things that had once seemed ordinary now felt valuable. Lewis thought about how quickly people became accustomed to comfort. At home, a warm room might be ignored. Here, warmth was precious. At home, clean water might be taken for granted. Here, a clear stream could feel like a gift. At home, silence might seem empty. Here, silence could be peaceful. Travel had changed the meaning of simple things. The fire burned steadily. The stars appeared. The river became darker. The men slowly became quiet. Lewis looked toward the water. He wondered how many nights they had left. He knew the expedition was approaching its eventual destination. But he also knew that every journey changes when the end becomes visible. At the beginning, the destination feels impossibly far away. In the middle, it becomes a distant idea. Near the end, it becomes real. And sometimes, reaching the destination is not the most important part. Sometimes the journey itself becomes the thing that remains. The men continued talking quietly. Someone mentioned home. Another man described what he wanted to eat when they returned. There was laughter. The conversation moved from one subject to another. The fire remained between them. A few sparks rose into the night. Lewis watched them disappear. He thought about the first fire, the strange silence, the uncertainty, how far away that night seemed now. The campfire had gone silent many times since then. Each time, the men had woken the next morning and continued. Perhaps that was the real lesson. A fire could go out, a night could end, a storm could pass, a mountain could be crossed, a river could be left behind. Everything changed. But the journey continued. Lewis finally leaned back. The night air was warm. His body felt heavy. His eyes were tired. The river made a soft sound. The fire crackled. He closed his eyes. For a moment, he simply listened. The sounds blended together: fire, water, wind, breathing. It felt peaceful, very peaceful. He opened his eyes one last time. The fire was still burning. The men were still sitting nearby. The stars were bright. The river reflected a narrow line of moonlight. He smiled. Then he stood. Time to sleep. Others nodded. One by one, they prepared their bedding. The camp became quieter. The fire remained. Lewis lay down. The blanket covered him. The ground beneath him was firm. The river continued flowing. His breathing slowed. His thoughts became distant. He thought about the mountains, then the river, then home, then nothing. Sleep arrived. Fire burned through the night. It remained steady for several hours. Then slowly the wood became charcoal. The flames became smaller. The glow softened. The camp became darker. One man woke briefly. He looked toward the fire. He saw the faint red coals. He did not add wood. There was no need. The morning was close. He returned to sleep. The fire continued fading. The stars slowly disappeared. The horizon began to brighten. And finally, the last ember became dark. The campfire went silent. Morning came. The men woke. The journey continued again and again and again, until eventually the rivers and mountains behind them became memories, until the unknown became familiar, until the road itself became a story. And perhaps that is how every great journey ends, not with one dramatic moment, but with countless ordinary mornings. A person wakes, a fire is rebuilt, a pack is lifted, a road is followed, and another day begins. Lewis and Clark continued west. Their expedition would eventually reach the Pacific. They would return. They would carry stories home. Their journey would become part of American history. But before all of that, there were these quiet nights. The nights beside the river, the nights beneath the mountains, the nights when the fire burned, and the nights when it went silent. Those moments belong to the travelers themselves, not to history, not to books, not to maps. They belong to the men who sat beside the flames, who watched the stars, who listened to the wilderness, who thought about home, who wondered what tomorrow would bring. And then eventually they slept. So let the story slow down now. Let the expedition move farther away. Imagine the camp disappearing behind the trees. Imagine the fire becoming smaller. Imagine the smoke rising gently into the night. Imagine the river flowing beside it. The explorers are resting. The mountains are quiet. The stars are above them. There is nothing left to fear, nothing left to solve. The journey can continue without attention. You do not need to follow every mile. You do not need to know what happens next. You can simply listen. The river moves. The wind passes. The fire glows. The night remains calm. And somewhere beneath the enormous American sky, a small group of travelers sleeps beside a fatting fire. Their journey continues in the morning. But for now, everything is still. The campfire goes silent. The wilderness remains. And the night carries the travelers gently into sleep. The morning after that quiet night was unusually gentle. There was no storm, no heavy wind, no difficult climb waiting immediately ahead. Only a pale blue sky and a soft breeze moving across the grass. The men rose slowly. They had become accustomed to the rhythm of waking in unfamiliar places. There was something almost comforting about it now. Open the eyes, look at the sky, find the fire, check the animals, prepare breakfast, pack the blankets, begin walking. The same simple actions repeated themselves every morning. And yet no two mornings were ever exactly alike. The light was different, the air was different, the landscape was different. Sometimes the men woke beside a river, sometimes beneath trees, sometimes on open grassland, sometimes beneath a rocky cliff, sometimes under a sky filled with stars. Their sleeping places changed constantly, but the small routine remained. Lewis watched the men preparing breakfast. He noticed how naturally they worked together now. One gathered wood, another prepared the food, someone checked the animals, someone else packed the equipment. Nobody needed to give many instructions. Months of travel had created a quiet understanding between them. A gesture was often enough, a glance, a nod, a hand pointing toward a trail. They had learned one another's habits. They knew who walked fastest, who became tired first, who was most careful with equipment, who could repair a broken strap, who could recognize weather changes, who was most likely to notice an animal nearby. The expedition had become a small world of its own, a world moving through a much larger one. After breakfast, they began walking again. The river remained beside them for a while. Its surface reflected the morning sky. Birds moved above the water. The grass was wet with dew. Lewis walked near the edge. He occasionally stopped to examine tracks in the mud. Some belonged to animals, others belonged to the expedition itself. Boot prints, horse prints, marks from equipment. Everywhere they traveled, they left temporary evidence of their presence. But the wilderness was patient. Rain would erase the tracks. Wind would cover them, grass would rise again. The river would wash away marks along the shore. Eventually, almost everything would disappear. Lewis found that thought strangely peaceful. They did not need to leave permanent footprints everywhere. They only needed to pass through, to observe, to learn, to remember. The expedition continued through the afternoon. The land gradually became more open. The horizon widened. The sky seemed enormous. Clouds moved slowly overhead. At one point, Lewis stopped walking. He looked toward the west. Far away, the horizon was almost completely flat. He wondered what lay beyond it, the ocean. Perhaps the thought felt almost unreal. For so long, the journey had been measured by rivers and mountains. Now the possibility of reaching the ocean was beginning to feel real. But still, there were many miles ahead, so the men continued. That evening, they found a quiet place beside a small stream. It was not particularly beautiful. There were no dramatic mountains, no great waterfall. No enormous trees, only grass, a few low shrubs, a stream, and a patch of dry ground, yet the men liked it immediately. It was sheltered, there was water nearby. There was enough wood for a fire, that was enough. They made camp. The sun slowly disappeared. The sky turned orange, then red, then purple. Finally, darkness arrived. The fire became the center of the camp. Its light touched the men's faces. Their shadows stretched across the ground. The horses stood quietly nearby. The stream moved in darkness. Someone began talking about the journey, not the great moments, the small ones, the time a horse had wandered away, the morning someone had fallen into the river, the evening when dinner had burned, the night when everyone had been convinced a strange animal was nearby, only to discover it was nothing more than a branch moving in the wind. The men laughed. These memories were becoming valuable. Hardship became funny after enough time had passed. A difficult day could eventually become a story. A cold night could become something to laugh about. A mistake could become a memory. Lewis listened. He realized that this was another part of exploration that would never appear on a map. The maps showed rivers, mountains, distances, coordinates, but they did not show laughter. They did not show tired faces around a fire. They did not show the sound of men remembering home. They did not show the quiet satisfaction of surviving another day. Yet those things were the real texture of the journey. The fire burned lower. The conversation became quieter. One by one, the men prepared to sleep. Lewis remained beside the fire. He watched the flames. A piece of wood collapsed. Sparks rose. For a moment, the sparks looked like tiny stars. Then they disappeared. He thought about how brief everything was: a spark, a sunset, a day, a life, a journey. Even the greatest moments passed. Perhaps that was why they were beautiful, because they did not last forever. Lewis finally lay down. The stream continued beside the camp. Its sound was soft enough to blend with his breathing. He closed his eyes. The fire warmed the air. The night was calm. There was no need to listen for danger, no need to think about tomorrow. His body was tired. His mind was quiet. He drifted into sleep. The fire continued burning. The moon rose. The stars moved across the sky. The stream never stopped. Hours passed. The fire became smaller. The flames changed from bright yellow to deep orange, then red. The camp grew darker still. Everyone slept. Near dawn, the final piece of wood collapsed into ash. A small ember remained. It glowed quietly beneath the darkness. Then the ember faded. The campfire went silent. Morning arrived. The men woke. The first person to rise looked at the cold ashes. He smiled. There was no disappointment. There was no concern. He knew what to do. He gathered wood. Soon another fire appeared. A new flame, a new morning, a new day. And perhaps that was the simplest truth of their journey. The fire could always be rebuilt. A difficult night did not mean a difficult life. A cold morning did not mean the journey was over. A silent fire did not mean there would be no warmth again. Every morning offered another beginning. The men packed their belongings. They left the campsite. Behind them, the fire was extinguished. The stream continued. The grass moved. The wind passed. Within a few hours, the campsite was almost impossible to recognize. The wilderness had begun reclaiming it, and the expedition moved farther west. Days passed. Then more days. The landscape slowly changed. The air became warmer. The land became broader. The rivers became different. The men met people they had never seen before. They learned new customs. They heard unfamiliar languages. They exchanged gifts. They listened. They observed. The expedition was no longer simply crossing land. It was entering the lives of people who already knew the country. The explorers realized that the wilderness was not empty. It had never been empty. People had lived across these lands for generations. They knew the rivers. They knew the mountains. They knew the seasons. They knew where food could be found. They knew which paths were safe. They knew where storms arrived first. The expedition depended on knowledge that already existed. Lewis understood this more clearly as the journey continued. The country was not waiting for them to discover it. It was already known by those who lived there. The explorers were discovering it from their own perspective. That realization gave him a deeper respect for the people they encountered. Every new meeting reminded him that there were many ways of understanding the same land. A river could be a line on a map, or it could be a home. A mountain could be an obstacle, or it could be sacred. A forest could be an unexplored region, or it could be a familiar place where someone knew exactly where to find food. The land had many meanings. The expedition was learning only one of them. That evening, the men camped again. The fire was small. The sky was clear. The stars appeared. Lewis sat quietly. He thought about the road behind them. So much had happened, yet so much had been ordinary. And perhaps ordinary was the most important word. Most of life was ordinary: walking, eating, sleeping, talking, waiting, watching the fire, listening to water, looking at stars. The extraordinary moments stood out because they were surrounded by ordinary ones. Lewis leaned back. The night air was warm. The fire crackled. The men slowly became silent. Another night was beginning, another chance to rest, another small circle of warmth beneath the enormous sky. The journey would continue tomorrow, but tonight the men could sleep. And so they did. The fire burned quietly. The stream moved through the darkness. The grass whispered beneath the wind. The stars remained overhead, and slowly, one by one, the travelers disappeared into dreams. The night became deeper, the fire became smaller, the world became still. And once again the campfire waited patiently for the moment when its flames would disappear, not as an ending, only as a pause, because morning would come. And with morning the fire would rise again, the road would open, the men would walk. And the long journey west would continue beneath the endless American sky. The next morning began without hurry. The sky was pale, the air was warm. A thin mist rested above the stream. The men woke one by one. For a while nobody spoke. There was something peaceful about the quiet morning. The fire had almost disappeared during the night. Only a few gray ashes remained. One of the men knelt beside them. He moved the ashes gently. A faint red glow appeared beneath them. He added a handful of dry grass. Then a few small sticks. He waited. The ember caught. A tiny flame appeared. He smiled. Soon the fire was alive again. Lewis watched from nearby. He thought about how many times they had performed this simple task. Hundreds of times, perhaps, maybe more. Every morning a dead fire became a living one. Every evening a living fire became ash. The cycle repeated. It reminded him of the journey itself. Begin, continue, rest, begin again. The men ate breakfast. Then they packed their belongings. The stream remained behind. The campsite disappeared. They moved west. The land was becoming increasingly unfamiliar. The mountains were now far behind them. The horizon was wide. Sometimes they could walk for hours without seeing anything that looked familiar. Yet the men were no longer uncomfortable with that feeling. They had grown accustomed to distance. They had grown accustomed to the unknown. They had learned that unfamiliar did not always mean dangerous. Sometimes unfamiliar simply meant new. During the afternoon, they reached a broad, grassy plain. The wind moved freely across it, tall grass bent in waves. The movement looked almost like water. Lewis stopped to watch. The sunlight moved across the field. The grass changed color as the wind passed. Golden green, golden again. He stood there quietly. The land seemed alive. Not alive in the way animals were alive, but moving, changing, breathing with the wind. The men continued. Several hours later, clouds began forming. The weather was changing. The expedition had learned to recognize the signs. They began looking for shelter. A small grove of trees appeared ahead. They moved toward it. The first drops of rain arrived just as they reached the trees. The men quickly began preparing camp. The rain became heavier. Leaves trembled. The ground became dark with water. The men gathered close beneath the trees. The fire was protected carefully. They had learned how precious fire could be during wet weather. A small flame survived. Smoke drifted upward. The rain continued. For hours, the world outside the trees disappeared. There was only water, rain on leaves, rain on grass, rain on clothing, rain on the earth. The men became quiet. Lewis sat near the fire. He watched the flames struggle against the damp air. The fire seemed fragile, yet it continued. A small flame surrounded by rain. Lewis smiled. Perhaps that was another lesson. Strength did not always look powerful. Sometimes strength was simply continuing to burn, even when everything around you was wet. Even when the wind tried to extinguish you, even when the night was cold, the fire continued. The rain finally stopped near sunset. The clouds began breaking apart. A golden light appeared between them. The wet grass reflected the sky. The men stepped out from beneath the trees. The air smelled fresh. Everything was quiet. The storm had passed. Lewis looked toward the west. The sky was clear again. The men prepared dinner. They ate while the last light disappeared. Then darkness arrived. The fire became brighter. The stars appeared. The men sat together. Nobody spoke for several minutes. They simply enjoyed the calm after the storm. The sound of the rain had disappeared. The wind was gentle. The fire was steady. The horses rested. The world felt safe. Lewis looked at the men. He wondered how many more nights like this remained. He did not know. But perhaps not knowing was part of the beauty. If every night were counted, every morning measured, every mile calculated, the journey might feel smaller instead. Each day arrived by itself. Each night came naturally. There was no need to force the future. It would come. The men began talking quietly. Someone mentioned home. Another man remembered a family member. Someone else talked about a meal he had eaten before the journey. The conversation drifted. Nothing important, nothing dramatic, just memories. That was enough. Eventually, the men grew tired. One by one, they prepared for sleep. Lewis remained near the fire. He looked into the flames. The fire was beautiful. It was not large. It did not need to be. A few pieces of wood, a little warmth, a little light. That was enough to create a place where people could rest. He thought about how many times fire had saved them. Not only physically, fire created a center, a place where people gathered, a place where stories were told, a place where silence felt comfortable, a place where tired people could feel less alone. Lewis lay down. The fire remained nearby. The stars were bright. His body relaxed. He listened to the night. A distant animal called. The horses shifted. The wind moved through the trees. Then everything became quiet again. His eyes closed. Sleep came slowly. The fire continued burning. Hours passed. The flames became smaller. The wood turned black. A red glow remained. The men slept. The moon moved across the sky. The stars slowly shifted. Near dawn, the final flame disappeared. Only embers remained. Then the embers became dark. The campfire went silent. The darkness lasted only a short time. The eastern sky was already becoming lighter. Morning was coming. The men would wake soon. They would build another fire. They would eat. They would pack. They would continue west. But before they woke, the campsite remained perfectly still. The grass was wet. The trees were dark. The horses slept. The ashes were cold. And the sky slowly changed from black to blue. A single bird began singing, then another. The world returned. Light touched the tops of the trees. The stream in the distance reflected the morning. The wilderness was waking. The expedition would wake too. Another day. Another road. Another unknown horizon. And the fire would return just as it always did. The story of the journey was not made from one great fire. It was made from hundreds of small fires, each one burning for a night, each one providing warmth, each one eventually becoming silent. But together they marked the path of the expedition. A chain of tiny lights stretching across the wilderness, from riverbank to riverbank, from forest to meadow, from mountain to valley, from east to west. And somewhere far ahead, beyond all the places they had yet to see, another campfire would one day burn. Another night would come. Another morning would follow. The journey would continue. For now, though, the morning light was growing stronger. The men began to stir. One moved beneath his blanket. Another sat up. A third looked toward the cold ashes. Soon someone would gather wood. Soon the fire would rise, and the expedition would move again, slowly, quietly, westward, under the wide American sky. The morning became brighter. The last shadows disappeared from the grass. The men finished their breakfast and prepared to leave. The cold ashes of the previous night's fire were scattered carefully. There was nothing dramatic about their departure. They simply packed their things and began walking. That was how most of the expedition moved through the wilderness. Not with ceremony, not with celebration, just one quiet departure after another. The trail followed a gentle stream for several miles. The water moved slowly between smooth stones. Trees grew along its banks. Birds moved through the branches. The men walked beside it. The rhythm was familiar, boots against earth, horses against grass, equipment moving softly, wind through leaves, water over stones. After several hours, the stream joined a larger river. The men stopped. Lewis studied the water. The river was broad and calm. Its surface reflected the sky. He watched a piece of wood floating downstream. It moved slowly at first. Then the current carried it around a bend. Lewis thought about the journey. They were much like that piece of wood. They had a direction. But the land and the river determined how quickly they moved. Sometimes they moved quickly. Sometimes they were forced to stop. Sometimes they had to change direction. But the current of the journey continued. The men rested beside the river. They drank water. The animals grazed. For a while, everyone simply enjoyed the quiet. The afternoon sun was warm. The air smelled of grass. A few clouds floated across the sky. It was one of those rare moments when nothing seemed difficult. Lewis sat beneath a tree. He closed his eyes for a few minutes. The river made a soft sound. The wind moved through the branches. He could almost imagine himself at home. Then he opened his eyes. The wilderness remained. He smiled. Home was still far away. But the feeling of home could appear anywhere. Sometimes beside a familiar river. Sometimes beneath a tree. Sometimes beside a small fire. Sometimes in a quiet moment. The expedition continued. By evening they found a suitable place to camp. The men had become very efficient, the horses were secured, supplies were arranged, wood was collected, the fire was built. Dinner was prepared, the sun disappeared, the sky turned dark blue, then black stars appeared. The men gathered around the fire. Tonight the mood was especially calm. There had been no major difficulties, no storms, no steep climbs, no dangerous river crossing. Just a long day of walking, a simple day. And sometimes simple days were the best. The men ate slowly, they talked quietly. Then silence settled over the camp, not an uncomfortable silence, a comfortable one. The kind that comes when people have spent enough time together that they no longer need constant conversation. Lewis looked around. He could see the tired faces illuminated by the fire. He thought about how different these men were from the people they had been when the expedition began. They had learned endurance. They had learned patience. They had learned to sleep almost anywhere. They had learned to appreciate warmth. They had learned to listen. Most importantly, they had learned to depend on one another. Lewis looked toward Clark. Clark was staring into the flames. For a while they said nothing. Then Clark spoke quietly. "Do you ever think about how this will be remembered?" Lewis considered the question. "Sometimes." "What do you think people will remember?" Lewis looked at the fire. "Probably the places. The rivers, the mountains, the ocean, perhaps." Clark smiled. "The nights." Lewis smiled too. "No, probably not the nights." They both looked around the camp, the small fire, the sleeping animals, the dark trees, the river, the stars. Lewis thought that was unfortunate, because the nights were important. The nights were when the men had time to think. The nights were when they remembered home. The nights were when they listened to the wilderness. The nights were when they rested enough to continue. The nights were when the journey became personal. History might remember the destination, but the travelers remembered the road. They remembered the cold mornings, the wet boots, the burned meals, the unexpected laughter, the quiet fires, the moments when nobody spoke, the stars, the wind, the feeling of waking in a completely unfamiliar place. Those were the memories that would remain inside them. The fire crackled, a spark rose, then disappeared. Clark stood. "It's getting late." Lewis nodded. "Yes." They prepared for sleep. The men wrapped themselves in blankets. The fire was left burning. Lewis lay down. The river flowed nearby. He listened to it. The sound was steady, predictable, comforting. His breathing slowed. He thought about the mountains. They were far behind now. But he could still remember the cold, the snow, the silence, the enormous peaks. He thought about the campfire there, how small it had looked beneath the mountains, how fragile, and yet how important. A tiny circle of light in a huge darkness. He realized that perhaps every human life was like that, small compared with the world, temporary, fragile, but still meaningful. A little warmth, a little light, a little time. Then the fire goes silent. Lewis closed his eyes. The night deepened. The stars moved. The river continued. The men slept. Hours passed. The fire slowly became smaller. The flames disappeared. The coals glowed. The glow weakened. Then only one ember remained. It was tiny, almost invisible, but it continued glowing for a while. Then it too became dark. The campfire went silent. The river remained. The wind remained. The stars remained. Nothing else changed. Morning was still far away. The men slept peacefully. No one needed to know about the fire. No one needed to watch it. It had done its work. It had provided warmth. It had provided light. Now it could rest. Just as the men rested, the night continued, deep and quiet. The stars slowly moved across the sky. A breeze passed over the grass. The river carried moonlight. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called. Then silence returned. The men continued sleeping. Their journey could wait. Their worries could wait. Their questions could wait. Morning would bring another road. But tonight there was only rest. And as the darkness slowly became lighter in the east, the silent campsite waited for another dawn. The fire was gone, but its warmth had lasted long enough. And soon, when the men woke, they would build another small flame, another circle of light, another beginning. The journey continued, quietly, patiently, westward. The campfire that went silent continued the next morning. The expedition woke beneath a sky washed clean by the night air. The river was calm. A thin mist floated just above the water, moving slowly with the breeze. For a few minutes the campsite remained almost completely still. Then came the familiar sounds of morning. A boot against the ground, a horse shifting its weight, someone gathering dry branches, someone else preparing breakfast. The routine returned. A small fire appeared among the cold ashes. Smoke rose gently. The men gathered around it. Nobody needed to explain what to do anymore. They had done it too many times. Lewis stood quietly at the edge of the camp. He watched the smoke disappear into the pale morning sky. He thought about all the fires they had left behind. Each one had marked a night. Each one had provided warmth. Each one had eventually gone dark. Yet every morning another fire had appeared. There was something comforting about that. The journey did not depend on a single fire. It depended on beginning again. After breakfast, they packed their belongings and continued west. The landscape was changing once more. The broad river gradually moved away from them. The ground became drier. Low hills appeared in the distance. Grass covered the slopes in soft waves. The men walked steadily. The horses followed. For hours, nothing unusual happened. And that was perfectly fine. A peaceful journey was made mostly from ordinary hours. The sun moved across the sky. Shadows changed direction. Birds called from distant trees. The wind carried the smell of dry grass. Occasionally, Lewis stopped to study a plant or an animal track. Then he continued. By afternoon, the men reached a high ridge. From there, they could see a vast stretch of country. Lewis stopped. He looked west. The horizon seemed endless. No mountains blocked the view. No thick forest covered the land. Only rolling country, rivers, distant hills, and an enormous sky. The men stood quietly. They had spent so long surrounded by mountains that the open horizon felt almost strange. Clark looked across the land. "It feels different here." Lewis nodded. "Very different." There was a softness to the landscape. The mountains had demanded effort. The open country invited movement. The expedition continued down the ridge. As evening approached, they found a sheltered place beside a small creek. The men decided to stop there. They unloaded the animals, collected wood, prepared food, and built their evening fire. The sun was already low. The flames looked bright against the growing darkness. The men sat around them. Someone spoke about the previous days. Someone else remembered the mountains. Another man wondered aloud how far they had traveled. Lewis listened. Distance was difficult to imagine. Thousands of miles could not truly be understood while standing beside a small fire. A person could understand 1 mile, perhaps 10, but thousands were too large for the mind. The journey had become a collection of individual days, one day after another, one campsite after another, one river after another, one fire after another. That was how distance became possible. The men finished eating. The conversation slowly faded. The creek continued moving nearby. The sound was gentle. The fire crackled. The night air became cooler. Lewis looked into the flames. He remembered the first nights of the expedition. There had been excitement then, questions, uncertainty, a sense that every day might bring something completely unexpected. Now the expedition felt different. The men had become accustomed to movement. They knew how to respond when something unexpected happened. They had learned patience. They had learned endurance. They had learned that most problems could be solved if everyone remained calm. Lewis wondered whether they would ever feel completely comfortable at home again. After living so long beneath open skies, would walls feel strange? After hearing rivers every night, would silence indoors feel unfamiliar? After waking with the sun, would a clock seem unnecessary? He did not know. Perhaps travel changed people in ways they only understood after returning. The fire burned lower. One of the men added another piece of wood. The flames rose. The light touched the surrounding grass. For a moment, the entire campsite seemed warm and alive. Then the fire settled again. Lewis leaned back. His eyes became heavy. He listened to the creek. The sound was steady, water over stones again and again and again. It became almost like breathing. The men began preparing for sleep. Blankets were spread. Equipment was placed nearby. Horses settled into the grass. The camp became quiet. Lewis lay down. The fire was only a few feet away. Its warmth reached him. He closed his eyes. The creek continued. The wind moved softly through the grass. The fire crackled. His breathing became slower. His thoughts began to fade. He imagined the road ahead, then the road behind, then nothing at all. Sleep came, deep and peaceful. The night passed. The moon moved slowly across the sky. The fire became smaller. The flames turned orange, then red, then only glowing coals remained. The creek continued flowing. The horses slept. The men slept. The stars watched silently overhead. Eventually, the last ember disappeared. The campfire went silent again. There was no sadness in it. The fire had completed its purpose. It had warmed the travelers. It had given them light. It had kept the darkness away for a few hours. Now the night could take over. The campsite became completely dark. But darkness was no longer something the men feared. They had learned to sleep within it. The wilderness had become familiar, not safe in every possible way, not predictable, but familiar enough. The night continued. A distant animal moved through the grass, the creek whispered. The wind passed. Then everything became quiet. Near dawn, the eastern horizon began to brighten. The stars faded, birds began calling, the men slowly woke. Someone reached toward the cold ashes. He gathered dry grass, a few small branches, then a larger piece of wood. He breathed gently, the ember caught. A tiny flame appeared, the fire returned, the same cycle again. Morning, fire, warmth, breakfast, travel, evening, fire, sleep, silence, then morning again. The expedition moved forward, the land continued changing. The journey continued. And the men continued learning that a long road did not need to be understood all at once. It only needed to be walked. One quiet morning, one peaceful evening, one small fire, one silent night. And somewhere beyond the western horizon the Pacific waited. The men could not yet see it, but they were getting closer. The mountains were behind them. The river was behind them. The long road east was behind them. Ahead was the ocean. And between the men and that distant water were more days, more nights, more rivers, more forests, and more quiet campfires. But for tonight none of that mattered. Tonight the travelers could rest, the fire could glow, the creek could whisper, the stars could move across the sky. And the wilderness could remain exactly as it was, quiet, wide, ancient, peaceful. The journey would continue tomorrow. For now the night belonged to sleep. The campfire that went silent continued. The days began to blend together. Morning followed night. Night followed evening. The expedition moved steadily westward, carrying its supplies, its maps, its hopes, and the quiet memories of every campsite left behind. The land was no longer completely strange. The men had begun to recognize certain patterns. They knew when the morning air would be cold. They knew where water was likely to collect. They knew how quickly a clear sky could become cloudy. They knew which horses needed more rest. They knew how much wood would be needed for a night fire. Small knowledge accumulated. And small knowledge made survival easier. One morning, Lewis woke before everyone else. The camp was silent. The fire had gone out during the night. The ashes were cold. He remained beneath his blanket for several minutes, watching the sky slowly brighten. There was something peaceful about being awake before the others. The wilderness belonged to the early morning. The grass was wet. The air was cool. A faint mist hovered over the nearby water. Birds had not yet begun their full morning chorus. Only one distant call could be heard. Lewis finally stood. He walked toward the stream. The water was perfectly clear. He knelt and drank. Then he washed his face. The cold water woke him completely. When he returned, the others were beginning to stir. Soon the campsite came alive. A fire was rebuilt. Breakfast was prepared. The animals were checked. The equipment was packed. Another morning began. They walked for several hours. The land rose gently. From the top of a low hill, Lewis could see a distant line of trees. Beyond it, another valley. Beyond that, another ridge. The country seemed to continue forever. He wondered how many mornings remained before the expedition would finally reach the Pacific. He could not know. But the question no longer bothered him. The journey had taught him patience. The destination would arrive when it arrived. Until then, there was only the road beneath his feet. Around midday, the men stopped near a group of trees. The shade was welcome. They rested and ate. The horses grazed nearby. A gentle breeze moved through the branches. One of the men leaned against a tree and closed his eyes. Another stretched his legs. Nobody wanted to speak. The quiet was comfortable. Lewis looked around. There was no great event happening, no discovery, no danger, no dramatic moment. Yet he knew he would probably remember this afternoon. The warmth, the shade, the smell of grass, the sound of leaves, the distant movement of horses, the simple feeling of being alive after a long morning of walking. History often remembered important moments, but people remembered feelings, and feelings were often created by ordinary things. A cool breeze, a warm fire, a quiet river, a peaceful morning. The expedition rested for nearly an hour, then they continued. The afternoon passed slowly, clouds moved across the sky, the sunlight softened. Eventually they found a place beside a broad meadow. It was a good campsite. There was water nearby. There was plenty of dry wood. The ground was level. The men began preparing for the night. The fire was built, dinner was cooked, the animals were secured. As the sun disappeared, the sky became enormous. The first stars appeared, then hundreds, then thousands. The men sat around the fire, the flames reflected in their tired eyes. Nobody seemed eager to speak. They simply watched the fire. Lewis understood why people were drawn to flames. A fire demanded nothing. It did not ask questions. It simply burned. It created warmth. It created light. It gave people a place to sit. And perhaps that was enough. The conversation eventually began, quietly. One man remembered a road near his home. Another talked about his family. Someone wondered what the weather would be like when they returned. The men laughed softly. For a moment, the distance between the wilderness and home seemed smaller. Lewis listened. He thought about the people waiting for them. Were they imagining where the expedition was? Were they wondering whether the men were safe? Were they looking at maps, perhaps? But nobody at home could truly imagine this place. They could not imagine the enormous sky, the smell of the grass after rain, the sound of a river at midnight, the cold of a mountain morning, the silence of a forest, the warmth of a tiny fire beneath the stars. Some experiences could only be understood by living them. Lewis looked at the fire. He thought about how many memories the flames had witnessed. Every campsite had its own story. Every fire had burned differently. Some had burned in rain, some in snow, some beneath mountains, some beside rivers, some beneath completely open skis. Yet every fire had performed the same simple task. It had made the darkness less dark, the night deepened. The men slowly became tired. One by one, they prepared their bedding. Lewis remained beside the fire. He watched the flames become smaller. A log broke apart. Sparks rose, they drifted upward, then disappeared. Lewis looked at the stars. For a moment, it was difficult to tell where the sparks ended and the stars began. He smiled. Then he lay down. The fire continued burning. The night was calm. The grass moved softly. The horses were quiet. The men slept. Hours passed. The moon moved higher. The fire became smaller. The flames disappeared. Only red coals remained, then orange, then faintly glowing gray. The last ember remained beneath a thin layer of ash. It glowed quietly. Then faded. The campfire went silent. The wilderness became dark again, but there was no fear, only rest. The men slept. The stars continued moving overhead. The meadow remained still. The river moved somewhere in the distance. The night passed without interruption, and eventually the eastern sky began to brighten. The first bird called, then another. The world slowly returned. A man woke. He sat up. He looked toward the ashes. Then he smiled. He knew what came next. Wood, grass, a little air, a new flame. Another beginning. The fire returned. The men gathered around it. Warmth returned to their hands. Breakfast followed. Then the packs, then the animals, then the road, and once again the expedition moved west. The journey continued, but something was different now. The men were beginning to sense that the end was no longer an impossible idea. The Pacific was somewhere ahead. They did not know how far. They did not know exactly when they would see it. But it existed. It was no longer simply a distant possibility. It was becoming a destination. Still, they did not rush. The road demanded patience. And the expedition had learned patience better than almost anything else, so they walked. The morning sun followed them. The wind moved across the grass. Birds flew overhead. The animals carried their loads. The men followed the trail. Behind them were countless campsites, countless fires, countless nights. Ahead was the western horizon, and somewhere beyond it the sound of waves. They could not hear those waves yet, but one day they would. For now there was only the road, and another evening waiting somewhere ahead, another fire, another quiet night. Another moment when the flames would eventually disappear, because that was the rhythm of the journey: fire, silence, morning, movement, and then fire again. The cycle continued beneath the enormous American sky, and as the men walked farther west, the mountains behind them faded into memory. The rivers behind them became distant stories. The old campsites disappeared beneath grass and weather. But the journey remained, step by step, day by day, night by night, until the ocean finally appeared. And when that moment came, they would know that every silent campfire had been part of the road that brought them there. For now, though, the men continued walking. The afternoon sun moved slowly across the sky. The western horizon waited, and the quiet road stretched ahead. The campfire that went silent continued. The afternoon slowly gave way to evening. The expedition continued across the open country. following a trail that curved gently between low hills. The men had grown quiet again. After so many months together, silence had become as natural as conversation. There was no need to fill every moment with words. The sound of walking was enough. Boots pressed into the earth, horses stepped through the grass, leather straps moved softly. A distant bird called from somewhere beyond the hills. The wind passed over the open land. It was a peaceful afternoon. Eventually, the men reached a small rise. From its top, they could see another river in the distance. The sunlight reflected from its surface. Lewis stopped. He studied the river carefully. It was not the ocean, not yet. But seeing another large body of water filled him with a quiet sense of progress. They had followed rivers for so long that water had become their guide. Whenever the land seemed confusing, they looked for water. Whenever the trail disappeared, they searched for signs of a river. Water connected the landscape. It connected one valley to another, one region to another, one day to another. Lewis watched the distant river for a long time. Then he turned toward the men. They continued down the hill. By sunset, they reached the riverbank. The water was wide and slow. Trees stood along the shore. The men decided to camp there. The familiar routine began. The animals were unloaded. Supplies were arranged. Wood was gathered. The fire was built. Dinner was prepared. Nothing unusual happened. And that was exactly what everyone wanted. They had traveled far enough. They wanted a quiet evening. The sun disappeared behind the trees. The sky turned gold, then orange, then deep blue. The first stars appeared above the river. The fire burned steadily. The men sat around it. Someone passed a small cup. Another man adjusted his blanket. A horse moved quietly in the darkness. The river continued flowing. Lewis watched the flames. He wondered how many fires had burned since the expedition began. Hundreds, perhaps thousands. Every fire had been temporary. Yet each had been important. The thought made him feel strangely grateful. A fire did not need to last forever to matter. Neither did a moment. Neither did a day. Neither did a journey. Some things were valuable precisely because they were temporary. Lewis looked across the river. The darkness was deep, but the stars reflected on the water. He could see a narrow trail of light moving with the current. It reminded him of the road ahead. There was always another mile, another bend, another morning. The men slowly became tired. The conversation faded. One by one, they prepared to sleep. Lewis remained beside the fire. He listened to the river. It was different from the rivers they had known before, but all rivers had something in common. They never seemed to hurry. They simply moved around rocks, through bends, past trees, toward places no one standing on the bank could see. Lewis closed his eyes for a moment. He imagined the ocean. He had never seen it from this direction. He wondered what it would look like after such a long journey. Would it seem larger than he imagined? Would the sound of waves feel strange? Would the men feel relief, or would they immediately begin thinking about the journey home? He did not know, perhaps both. The fire crackled. Lewis opened his eyes. The flames were smaller now. He added one final piece of wood. Then he stood. The camp was quiet. He looked around. Everything was peaceful. The men were asleep. The horses were resting. The river was moving. The stars were bright. He walked to his bedding, lay down and closed his eyes. Sleep came quickly. The night passed. The fire slowly weakened. The flames became smaller. The river continued. The stars moved. The moon crossed the sky. Eventually, only embers remained. A soft red glow rested beneath the ash. Then the glow faded. The campfire went silent. The river did not. It continued moving through the darkness. That was the difference. The fire stopped. The river continued. The travelers slept. The road waited. Morning eventually arrived. The eastern sky became pale. The stars disappeared. Birds began singing. A cool breeze moved across the river. One of the men woke. He sat up. For a moment he looked at the dark ashes. Then he began gathering wood. Soon the fire returned. A tiny flame, then a larger one. Smoke rose into the morning air. The others woke. Breakfast was prepared. The horses were packed. The camp was dismantled. The men crossed the river. Then they continued west. Another day, another road, another horizon. As the sun climbed higher, Lewis noticed something unusual. The land seemed to be changing again. The vegetation was different. The air carried a faint, unfamiliar scent. The men began seeing signs of the ocean's influence. The landscape seemed wetter. The air felt different. They did not yet see the Pacific, but they were getting closer, very close. Still, they continued at the same slow pace. There was no reason to rush. After so many months of travel, a few more miles were nothing. The road passed through forests. The trees became taller, the undergrowth thicker, the air cooler, rain appeared more frequently. The men adapted, they wrapped their belongings carefully, they protected their supplies, they moved through the forest, the world became greener. The sound of water was everywhere, small streams crossed the trail, rain fell softly through the leaves, mist gathered in the distance. The mountains appeared again. But these mountains were different, they were covered with dense forests. Their slopes disappeared into clouds. The expedition moved carefully. The path was narrow. The ground was wet. The horses stepped slowly, everyone was tired. Yet there was a feeling of anticipation, the end was approaching. Nobody said it directly, but everyone knew they could feel it. The men walked through the forest for hours. Then late in the afternoon they reached a clearing, the trees opened, a broad valley appeared. And far beyond the valley was a faint blue-gray horizon. Lewis stopped. He stared. Could it be? He said nothing. Clark looked in the same direction. For several moments neither man spoke. The others gathered around them, everyone looked. The horizon was distant, too distant to be certain, but something about it felt different, the air, the light, the openness. Perhaps the ocean was there, perhaps they would know soon. The men continued down the trail slowly, quietly. The sun began to set. They needed a campsite. They found one beside a small creek. The fire was built. Dinner was prepared. But the conversation was different tonight. The men spoke about the possibility of seeing the ocean soon. Some wondered what it would sound like. Some wondered what it would smell like. Some wondered how far away it really was. Lewis listened. He did not make promises. He had learned not to trust distant appearances. The wilderness had fooled them before. A mountain that looked close could take days to reach. A river that seemed narrow could become difficult to cross. A trail that looked easy could disappear completely. So they would wait. They would continue. They would see. The fire burned. The night became dark. Lewis looked toward the distant horizon. Tomorrow might be the day, or perhaps the next. Either way, they were close, very close. The men gradually fell silent. The fire crackled. The creek whispered. The trees moved softly in the wind. Lewis lay down. He closed his eyes. For months he had imagined this moment. Now that it was near, he felt surprisingly calm. There was no need to rush toward tomorrow. Tomorrow would come naturally. For tonight, there was only rest. The fire burned beside the sleeping camp. The stars appeared above the trees. The creek continued moving. The men slept. And slowly the flames began to weaken. The fire became smaller. The light faded. The embers glowed beneath the ash. Then the final ember disappeared. The campfire went silent. But this time the silence felt different. Tomorrow might bring the ocean. Tomorrow might bring the end of one great chapter. And after that, another journey would begin. The journey home. But tonight, the men did not think about home. They slept, deeply, quietly. Under the western sky, and the forest waited for morning. The campfire that went silent continued. Morning came with the sound of rain. Not heavy rain, just a soft, steady drizzle falling through the trees. The men woke slowly. The fire had gone completely cold. Gray ashes rested beneath the damp wood. Someone carefully searched for a dry place beneath a tree. There was still a little dry grass, a few thin branches. After several attempts, a tiny flame appeared. It struggled. The rain continued. But the men protected it with their hands and pieces of bark. Slowly, the flame grew. Soon there was enough fire to warm their hands. Lewis watched it quietly. He thought about the many times fire had seemed impossible to start. Yet somehow there was always a way, a little dry grass, a little patience, a little protection from the wind. Sometimes that was all that was needed. The men ate a simple breakfast. Then they prepared to move. The rain continued as they entered the forest. The trees were enormous. Their branches formed a dark roof above the trail. Water dripped steadily from the leaves. The ground was soft beneath their feet. The horses moved carefully. Nobody spoke much. The forest itself seemed to demand quiet. The expedition moved deeper into the trees. For hours, the trail wound between moss-covered trunks and thick vegetation. Everything was green, deep green, soft green, wet green. Mist hung between the trees. Small streams crossed the path. The men stepped over them. Sometimes they had to stop and clear branches from the trail. The work was slow, but nobody complained. The thought of the ocean was enough to keep everyone moving. Around midday, the rain finally stopped. Sunlight appeared through the clouds. It touched the wet leaves. Thousands of small drops began shining. The forest looked almost covered in glass. Lewis stopped. He looked upward. The sunlight was beautiful. He smiled. After so many difficult days, beauty could still surprise him. The men continued. The forest gradually became less dense. The ground began sloping downward. The air became cooler. Then suddenly Lewis heard something, a sound, very faint. He stopped walking. Everyone behind him stopped too. They listened. At first there was nothing, only wind. Then the sound came again. A distant rumble, low, continuous, almost like thunder. But there were no clouds. Lewis looked at Clark. Clark understood. They began moving forward. The sound became clearer. It was not thunder, it was water, but not a river. Something much larger. The men walked faster. The trail emerged from the trees. They reached the edge of a rocky slope. And there beyond the trees was the Pacific Ocean. For a moment nobody moved. The ocean stretched across the horizon, endless, gray-blue, moving beneath the cloudy sky. Waves rolled toward the shore again and again and again. The men simply stared. After months of rivers, after mountains, after forests, after endless roads, they had reached the western edge of the continent. The ocean was real. Lewis stood silently. He looked across the water. There was no visible end. The horizon seemed to disappear into the sky. The sound of the waves filled the air. It was powerful, but strangely calming. Clark stood beside him. Neither man needed to say anything. They had arrived. The men moved toward the shore. Some laughed, some simply stood. One man removed his hat. Another knelt and touched the water. It was cold, very cold, but he smiled. Lewis walked along the shoreline. He watched the waves break over the sand. He thought about the Missouri. The river had carried them west. Now the ocean received them. A journey that had begun with a river had reached the sea. Lewis stood at the water's edge. He allowed a wave to reach his boots. Then he stepped back. The ocean stretched endlessly before him. For a moment he felt very small, and somehow that was comforting. The world was larger than any map, larger than any expedition, larger than any individual. The men had traveled far, but there would always be more beyond the horizon. Lewis looked back toward the forest. The mountains were hidden behind the trees. Somewhere beyond them were the valleys, the rivers, the plains, the distant Missouri. Everything they had crossed was now behind them. The journey west had reached its destination. But the journey itself had not truly ended. They would have to return. There would be another long road, another winter, another set of rivers, another collection of campfires. Still, that could wait. For today they had reached the ocean. The men spent the afternoon near the shore. They explored the beach. They watched the waves. They studied the unfamiliar landscape. Eventually, they selected a place for camp. It was close enough to hear the ocean, but protected enough from the wind. The men gathered wood, built a fire, prepared food. The sun began disappearing. The sky turned silver, then orange, then purple. The ocean reflected the changing light. The waves continued rolling toward the shore. The fire burned beside the camp. Lewis sat near it. For the first time since the expedition began, there was no farther west to go. He found the thought strange. Every morning had always meant moving forward. There was always another place ahead, another river, another mountain, another trail. Now the horizon was water. He smiled. The journey had taught him how to keep moving. Now it was teaching him how to stop. The men sat around the fire. They talked quietly. They remembered the beginning. They remembered the first river, the early camps, the difficult crossings. Mountains, the snow, the storms, the quiet nights, the fires, so many fires. Someone asked, "How many campfires do you think we've built?" Nobody knew, perhaps hundreds, perhaps more. Lewis looked into the flames. He thought about every fire they had left behind. Everyone had eventually gone silent, yet each had helped them reach the next morning. This fire would be no different. It would burn tonight. Then it would disappear. But the journey would remain. The memories would remain. The ocean would remain. The night grew darker. The stars appeared above the Pacific. The sound of the waves became louder in the darkness. Lewis lay down. He listened. Wave, pause, wave, pause. The rhythm was almost hypnotic. The men became quiet. The fire crackled. The ocean breathed. Lewis closed his eyes. He thought about the road home. But he did not think about every mile. He did not need to. Tomorrow would take care of tomorrow. Tonight was for rest. The fire burned. The waves continued. The stars moved overhead. The men slept. Slowly, the fire became smaller. The flames weakened. The wood became glowing embers. The ocean continued. The wind moved through the grass. The final flame disappeared. Only a faint red glow remained. Then that too faded. The campfire went silent, but the ocean did not. It continued rolling onto the shore, wave after wave, without hurry, without stopping. The men slept beside it. For the first time they were sleeping at the western edge of their continent. Behind them lay the enormous distance they had crossed. Ahead lay the endless ocean. Above them stretched the same stars that had watched them beside rivers and mountains. The journey had brought them here, and now the Pacific kept them company through the night. The fire was gone, the light was gone, but the sound of the waves remained steady, gentle, endless. And beneath the western sky, the exhausted explorers finally rested. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of the journey home. But tonight there was nothing left to do, only sleep, only waves, only stars. Only the quiet breathing of the men who had traveled farther than they had ever imagined. The ocean continued moving in the darkness, and the night remained peaceful. The campfire that went silent continued. Morning arrived slowly beside the Pacific. The first light appeared over the water. The ocean was calm. Long waves rolled toward the shore and disappeared beneath the pale morning mist. The men woke to the sound of water. For a moment they simply listened. There was no riverbank, no forest stream, no mountain wind. Only the ocean. They had finally reached the western edge of their journey. Lewis stepped outside the shelter. The morning air was cool. He walked toward the water. The sand was damp beneath his boots. He stood at the shoreline and watched the waves. The ocean seemed endless. He had spent so long following rivers that he almost expected the water to lead somewhere visible. But the ocean had no visible path. It simply stretched toward the horizon. Lewis thought about the journey behind him. Thousands of miles, countless days. Hundreds of nights, cold mornings, wet evenings, long stretches of walking, quiet conversations, unexpected difficulties, moments of laughter, moments of fear, and countless small fires. He wondered how different the world would feel when they eventually returned home. The thought of home made him smile, but he knew there was still a long journey ahead. The expedition could not remain beside the Pacific forever. They needed to return. They needed to retrace much of the route. They needed to carry their observations, maps, notes, and memories back east. Still, there was no need to begin that journey immediately. For a little while they could simply remain where they were. The men explored the shoreline. They studied the tide. They watched birds moving above the water. They examined shells and stones. Everything was unfamiliar. The Pacific had its own rhythm. The waves arrived. The waves disappeared. The tide changed. The wind shifted. The horizon remained. By afternoon, the men had become accustomed to the sound. The ocean no longer seemed strange. It had become another companion, like the Missouri, like the mountains, like the forests. That evening they built another fire. The wood burned brightly. The men gathered around it. The ocean was only a short distance away. Its sound continued through the darkness. Wave after wave, the men talked about home. They imagined familiar streets, warm rooms, family meals, people they had not seen for a very long time. The conversation became gentle. Nobody wanted to rush through the memories. Lewis listened quietly. He realized that distance made small memories powerful. A familiar voice, a particular meal, the sound of a door opening, the smell of wood smoke, the sight of a familiar road. Things that once seemed ordinary had become precious. He wondered whether home would feel exactly the same. Perhaps it would. Perhaps it would not. People changed. Places changed. Even when a person returned to the same house, they might no longer be the same person who had left it. The journey changed everyone. The men had seen too much to return exactly as they were. The fire burned. The ocean continued. The stars appeared. Lewis looked upward. The same stars had watched them cross the continent. They had been there above the Missouri, above the mountains, above the plains, above every campsite. Now they were above the Pacific. The stars had not changed. Only the travelers had. Lewis smiled. He felt tired. Very tired. But it was a peaceful kind of tiredness. The kind that comes when something enormous has been completed. He lay down. The ocean became his nighttime music. Wave, pause, wave, pause. The fire crackled beside him. His eyes closed. He listened. The ocean seemed to breathe slowly, steadily. The sound carried him towards sleep. The men slept. The fire continued burning. The night grew deeper. The moon appeared above the water. Its reflection moved across the waves. The fire became smaller. The flames turned orange, then red. The men remained asleep. The ocean continued. The wind moved softly. Eventually, only glowing embers remained. The campfire went silent. But the Pacific continued its endless rhythm. Wave, pause, wave, pause. The silence of the fire no longer mattered. The ocean was enough. The men slept peacefully beside it. And as the hours passed, the moon slowly crossed the sky, the tide changed. The waves grew slightly larger, then smaller again. The world continued moving. Near dawn, the horizon became pale. The stars disappeared. The ocean turned silver. Birds began calling. The men woke. Another morning, another beginning. The fire would be rebuilt. Breakfast would be prepared. The expedition would begin thinking about the road home. But before that happened, Lewis walked once more toward the water. He stood at the edge. A wave reached his boots. He looked across the ocean. Then he turned around. Behind him was the continent, a vast land stretching thousands of miles east. The road home waited. He smiled. They had come west. Now they would go east. The journey was becoming a circle, and perhaps every great journey eventually does. A person leaves, a person travels, a person changes, and eventually a person returns. But the person who returns is never exactly the same. Lewis walked back toward the camp. The men were beginning to prepare breakfast. The fire was burning again. Smoke rose into the morning air. He watched the flame. The familiar warmth returned. It was almost comforting. The same fire that had appeared beside countless rivers was now burning beside the Pacific. The world had changed. The fire had not. It still provided warmth, still provided light, still gathered people together, still eventually went silent. Lewis smiled. The expedition had reached the ocean, but the story of the campfire was not finished. There would be more nights, more fires, more silence, more mornings, and eventually home. The men packed their belongings. The animals were prepared. The shoreline remained behind them. They began moving east. The Pacific slowly disappeared from view, but its sound remained in their memories, wave after wave, a reminder of how far they had traveled. The road home began. The men walked quietly. The morning sun followed them. Behind them, the ocean remained. Ahead, the continent stretched endlessly. The journey had turned around, but the rhythm was unchanged. Walk, rest, camp, fire, sleep, morning, then walk again. And as the explorers disappeared into the distance, the last view of the Pacific faded behind the trees. Another chapter had ended. Another had begun. But somewhere along the shore, the ashes of their final western camp remained. The fire was cold. The footprints would soon disappear. The wind would cover the ground. The waves would continue. And the wilderness would slowly erase every sign that the travelers had ever been there. Yet the journey itself could never be erased. It had already become part of them. And the road home stretched quietly ahead. The campfire that went silent continued. The journey east began quietly. There was no celebration when they left the Pacific. The men simply packed their belongings, secured the animals, and followed the trail back into the forest. Behind them, the sound of waves slowly became softer, then softer still. Eventually, it disappeared completely. For the first time in many months, they were traveling toward a place they already knew. But even the familiar road looked different when seen from the opposite direction. The forest seemed different. The mountains seemed different. The rivers seemed different. Perhaps the land had changed. Perhaps they had. They walked through the trees for several days. Rain came and went. The trails were muddy. The animals became tired. The men moved slowly. There was no reason to hurry. They had already accomplished what they had come to do. Now they needed to return safely. One evening, they stopped beside a small stream. The men built their camp. A fire appeared. The flames reflected in the water. Lewis sat beside it. He listened to the stream. It reminded him of the countless waterways they had followed. Every river had its own character. Some were fast, some were calm. Some were dangerous, some were beautiful. But all of them moved forward. Lewis watched the fire. He thought about the Pacific. Only a few days had passed since they stood beside the ocean. It had already seemed distant. That was the strange thing about travel. A place could be unforgettable while you were there. Then once you left, it slowly became a memory. The men ate dinner. The night was cold. They gathered close to the fire. Someone asked Lewis whether he believed the journey home would be easier. Lewis smiled. Some parts. The difficult parts. Those will still be difficult. Men laughed. They knew he was right. Returning did not make the mountains smaller. It did not make the rivers easier. It did not make the weather predictable, but they now had experience. They knew what waited ahead. That knowledge was valuable. The fire burned steadily. The men became quiet. Lewis looked at the stars. He remembered the night they had first crossed the mountains. The sky had been filled with stars then too. The same stars, different place. Different direction, different men. He wondered how many more nights he would spend beneath that sky. The thought made him strangely peaceful. There was no need to count, he simply needed to rest. The fire continued burning, the stream continued flowing. The horses stood quietly nearby. The night became deeper. Lewis lay down. His blanket felt warm, the ground was hard, but he was accustomed to it. He closed his eyes. The stream became a soft rhythm, water, stone, water, stone. His breathing slowed, the fire crackled. Then the sounds began fading, sleep came. The fire burned for several more hours. Eventually the flames became smaller, the men slept, the stars moved, the moon disappeared, the fire became embers, the embers became ash, the campfire went silent, the stream continued, morning arrived, the men woke, the fire was rebuilt, another breakfast, another departure, another day. They followed the trail toward the mountains. The journey back would take them through places they had already crossed, but familiarity brought its own strange feeling. A hill that had once seemed enormous now looked smaller. A trail that had once been confusing now seemed recognizable. A river that had once frightened them now seemed familiar. Experience had changed the scale of the world. They reached the mountains again. The peaks rose ahead. The men looked upward. The mountains were still enormous. But they no longer felt impossible. They knew the route. They knew where the slopes became steep. They knew where snow might remain. They knew where water could be found. The climb began slowly. One step at a time, the horses struggled, the men helped. The air became colder, the trees became smaller, the wind became stronger. For several days the expedition climbed. The men slept beneath cold skis. Each evening they built a fire. Each night the flames eventually disappeared. The rhythm continued. One night they camped beneath a rocky cliff. Snow began falling. The men gathered close to the fire. Lewis watched the flakes disappear into the darkness. He remembered their first crossing, the same mountains, the same cold. But this time he felt different. The mountains no longer seemed like an unknown wall. They were simply part of the road. That was perhaps one of the greatest changes the journey had created. The unknown had become familiar. The men knew they could cross. They had already done it. They only needed to do it again. Lewis lay down. The fire burned beside him. Snow fell softly. The mountains stood silently. The night was peaceful. He listened to the wind. It moved over the rocks, then faded. The fire crackled. His eyes closed. He slept. Hours passed. The fire became smaller. The snow continued falling. The flames disappeared. The embers glowed, then faded. The campfire went silent. The mountains remained. The men slept. Morning came slowly. The snow had stopped. The sky was pale. The mountains were covered in white. The men woke. They rebuilt the fire. Warmth returned. They ate, then continued down the mountain. The descent was easier. The land gradually became warmer. Trees became taller. The air softened. Soon they reached the valleys again. The journey began to feel familiar. The rivers returned. The grasslands returned. The wide open sky returned. And with every mile eastward, the Pacific became more distant, but home became closer. The men began speaking about it more often. They wondered what had changed while they were away. What had happened during those long months? Who had grown older? Who had married? Who had moved? What would the towns look like? What would the first familiar road feel like beneath their feet? Nobody knew. The thought of home gave them energy. Still, they did not rush. They had learned the value of patience. The journey would end when it ended. That evening they camped beside another river. The fire was built. The men ate. Then they sat quietly. Lewis listened to the water. It sounded almost like the Missouri. For a moment he imagined that he was already home. Then he opened his eyes. The wilderness remained, but home was coming closer. The fire burned. The stars appeared. The men rested, and slowly the flames began to fade. The fire became smaller. The night became darker. The last ember glowed, then disappeared. The campfire went silent. But this silence felt different from the silence of the journey west. They were no longer walking into uncertainty. They were walking toward familiarity. The road ahead was still long, but now every mile carried them closer to home. The river flowed beside the sleeping camp. The stars watched from above. The wind moved through the grass. And somewhere far to the east, beyond countless miles of wilderness, waited the place where their journey had begun. The men slept. Tomorrow they would continue, and the day after that, and the day after that, until eventually the wilderness would become the road would become the river would become the familiar country, and the long journey would finally bring them home. The campfire that went silent continued the next morning. The river was covered in a thin layer of mist. The men woke quietly. Familiar routine began once more. A little wood, a little flame, warmth for cold hands, breakfast, packing, then the road. They had been traveling for so long that the rhythm seemed almost natural. There was something comforting about knowing what came next. The trail followed the river eastward. The current moved in the same direction. Sometimes the river disappeared behind trees. Sometimes it opened into wide stretches of sunlight. The men walked beside it. Lewis occasionally looked back. He could still remember the Pacific. The sound of the waves, the endless horizon, the feeling of standing at the western edge of the continent. Now the ocean was behind them. The road home was ahead. The mountains slowly disappeared behind distant hills. The land became more familiar. The men began recognizing places they had passed before. A particular bend in the river, a large tree, a rocky slope, a meadow, a narrow trail. Memories returned with each mile. It was strange to realize that a place once completely unknown could become familiar. The men were seeing the same landscape again, but they were seeing it with different eyes. They had changed. Their experience had changed them. The wilderness had taught them patience. It had taught them that comfort could be simple. It had taught them that darkness did not always mean danger. It had taught them to appreciate warmth. And perhaps most importantly, it had taught them how temporary everything was. A campsite disappeared. A fire went out. A trail vanished beneath grass. A footprint disappeared in rain. Yet the memory remained. That evening they stopped beside a familiar-looking stretch of river. The men began building their camp. Lewis recognized the place. They had passed somewhere near it during the journey west. He remembered the night. It had been cold. The men had been exhausted. Someone had complained about the food. Someone else had laughed. A small fire had burned until dawn. Lewis smiled. Now they were here again, the same river, the same trees, perhaps even the same stones, but a completely different moment. He wondered how many places along the route would feel this way, old memories appearing inside new days. The fire was ready, dinner was prepared. The men sat around it. The conversation was quiet. They were beginning to think more about home. One man talked about seeing his family again. Another wondered whether his children had grown. Someone else said he wanted nothing more than a comfortable bed. Everyone laughed. A comfortable bed sounded like a luxury beyond imagination. Lewis understood. After sleeping on hard ground for so long, even a simple mattress might feel extraordinary. The fire burned. The men grew quiet. Lewis looked at the flames. He thought about the first campfire of the expedition. How excited everyone had been. How uncertain the future had seemed. At that time, the journey ahead was an enormous unknown. Now they were returning with the unknown behind them. Yet the road still felt long. Perhaps every ending feels far away until the final miles. The fire crackled. A spark rose. Lewis watched it disappear. He thought about the people they had met, the landscapes they had seen, the rivers they had followed, the mountains they had crossed. So many memories. It would be difficult to explain all of them when they returned. Words could describe places, maps could show distances, but words could not completely describe what it felt like to stand beneath the mountains at night, or hear the Pacific for the first time, or wake beside a river in complete darkness. Some experiences belonged only to the people who lived them. Lewis leaned back. The night was calm, the stars were bright. The river moved gently. The fire was warm. He closed his eyes. He listened. Water, fire, wind, breathing, the same sounds that had accompanied them throughout the journey. Sleep came slowly. The fire remained. The river continued. The night deepened. The men slept. Hours passed. The fire became smaller. The flames weakened. The embers glowed. Then the glow faded. The campfire went silent. The river continued. The stars remained. The night moved toward morning, and once again the darkness was peaceful. There was no need for fear, no need for worry, only rest. Eventually the eastern sky became lighter. The stars disappeared. Birds began singing. The men woke. The fire was rebuilt. The camp came alive. Another breakfast, another morning, another day closer to home. They packed their belongings, then continued east. The river guided them. The trail carried them. The sun rose higher. The men walked. By afternoon, they reached a wide clearing. From there, the landscape looked familiar. The country they had traveled months earlier was slowly returning. The men began remembering details: a distant hill, a particular bend, a place where they had once stopped. The journey west seemed like another lifetime, yet it had happened. They had lived it. Now they were returning from it. The road continued. That evening, they found another campsite. The fire was built. The men ate. Then they sat quietly. Nobody seemed eager to speak. Perhaps everyone was thinking about home. Lewis looked toward the east. He imagined the first familiar settlement, the first familiar road, the first familiar face. It was getting closer. The journey was becoming an ending, but he knew something now. An ending did not erase the journey, it completed it. The difficult mornings mattered. The silent nights mattered. The cold fires mattered. The long walks mattered. Every small moment had carried them forward. The fire burned lower. Lewis watched it. He knew what would happen. The flames would disappear, the embers would fade, the night would become silent, then morning would come. It always did. He lay down. The river whispered nearby. The fire warmed the air, the stars appeared, his eyes closed, and once again sleep came. The flames slowly weakened, the night deepened, the campfire went silent. But this time the silence carried a quiet promise. Home was getting closer. The road was shortening. The long journey was approaching its final miles. And beneath the peaceful night sky, the travelers rested. Tomorrow would bring another morning, another fire, another road, another step toward home. The campfire that went silent continued the following morning, arrived beneath a soft gray sky. The men woke to a familiar sound, the river. It had become almost like a companion throughout the journey. Even when the men slept, the water continued moving. Even when the fire disappeared, the river remained. Lewis sat beside it for a few minutes before the others were fully awake. He watched the current. He thought about how much of their journey had been shaped by water. The Missouri had carried them west. Smaller rivers had guided them through unfamiliar country, streams had provided drinking water. And now this river was helping them return east. Water had been both road and guide. Lewis stood. The morning routine began. The fire was rebuilt. Breakfast was prepared. The animals were checked. The packs were secured. Then they moved on. The journey had become quieter now. There was less excitement, less uncertainty. The men knew they were getting closer. Every familiar landmark gave them another reminder. Home was no longer an idea. It was becoming a place they could almost imagine. They walked through open country. The grass moved in the breeze. The sky was clear. A few clouds drifted slowly overhead. The men traveled for hours. Around midday, they stopped near a large tree. The shade was cool. Everyone rested. One man removed his boots. Another leaned against the trunk. Someone shared a little food. For a while, nobody spoke. The quiet afternoon seemed endless. Lewis looked at the men. Their clothing was worn. Their faces were darker from months beneath the sun and wind. Their equipment showed signs of the journey. But they were still together. That mattered. The expedition had faced uncertainty many times, yet the group had remained intact. There had been disagreements. There had been difficult days. There had been exhaustion. But there had also been loyalty, patience, humor, and friendship. Lewis realized that no great journey could be completed alone. Even the strongest person eventually needed someone else. Someone to carry a load, someone to share food, someone to help across a river, someone to sit beside a fire, someone to listen. The afternoon continued. The men began walking again. As evening approached, they found a quiet place near a familiar bend in the river. Lewis recognized it immediately. They had camped nearby during the journey west. The memory returned, the same water, the same hills, perhaps the same trees. He stood quietly. Months earlier, they had been moving west. Now they were returning east. The difference was almost impossible to describe. The landscape had become a kind of memory book. Every bend seemed to contain a story. The men built their camp. The fire burned, dinner was prepared. The evening was peaceful. The sky was clear enough to reveal thousands of stars. The men sat around the fire. Someone began telling a story from the early part of the expedition. Everyone remembered it. The story became funnier as it was retold. Laughter spread around the fire. For a few moments the men seemed less tired. They were simply friends sharing an old memory. Lewis smiled. He understood that these moments might be the memories they carried home more than anything else. Not the maps, not the measurements, not the official records, but laughter around a fire, the sound of friends, the warmth of a simple meal, the feeling of surviving another day together. Eventually, the laughter faded. The men became quiet. The fire continued burning. Lewis looked into the flames. He thought about the ocean. It was now far behind them. The waves were still rolling against the western shore. The mountains were standing in the distance. The forests were quiet. The campsites were disappearing, but the expedition was moving home. The fire burned lower. Lewis added another piece of wood. The flames rose briefly, then settled. He watched them. There was something almost hypnotic about fire. The movement never repeated exactly. Every flame was different. Every spark disappeared differently. Yet the overall rhythm remained. Burn, glow. Fade, silence, morning, then begin again. Lewis lay down. The night was calm. The river moved nearby. The fire crackled softly. His body relaxed. His thoughts became slower. He listened to the water. He listened to the wind. He listened to the breathing of the men nearby. Then he fell asleep. The fire burned through the night. The stars moved overhead. The river continued. Eventually, the flames became smaller. The wood turned black. The embers glowed. The light weakened. Then the final ember disappeared. The campfire went silent. The darkness returned, but it was not an empty darkness. The river was still there. The stars were still there. The sleeping men were still there. The journey was still there. The darkness simply became part of the night. Hours passed. Then morning began. A faint light appeared in the east. Birds called. The river reflected the first light. One of the men woke. He looked toward the ashes, then began preparing another fire. A small flame appeared. It grew. Smoke rose. Warmth returned. The others woke. The campsite became alive again. The men ate. They packed. They prepared the animals. Then they continued east. Another day, another road, another memory. The land became increasingly familiar. The men began seeing signs that civilization was not impossibly far away. Paths became more obvious. Travel became easier. The country felt less wild. The men noticed. They spoke about it quietly. They were getting closer. Soon, they would see familiar settlements. Soon, they would meet people who had heard nothing from them for months. Soon, they would be able to tell the story. But for now, they continued walking. The sun climbed. The river moved beside them. The road stretched ahead. The men did not rush. They had learned that the final miles were still miles. They still had to be walked, so they walked slowly, patiently, together. And as the afternoon light stretched across the landscape, Lewis looked east. He could not yet see home, but he could feel that it was coming closer. The long expedition was beginning to close. The mountains were behind them. The Pacific was behind them. The unknown frontier was behind them. Ahead was home. And another evening waited, another camp, another fire, another night beneath the stars. The journey continued quietly toward its final chapter. And as the sun began to sink, the men kept walking beneath the wide American sky. The campfire that went silent continued. The sun was low when the men finally stopped walking. The evening light stretched across the grass, turning the familiar landscape soft and golden. They had traveled far that day. Nobody complained. Nobody needed to. They simply knew it was time to rest. The horses were unloaded. The packs were placed carefully on the ground. Someone gathered dry branches. Another man prepared the food. Soon a small fire appeared. The flames rose quietly. For the travelers, it was an ordinary sight. But Lewis watched it for a long moment. He realized that this might be one of the last times they would need to build a campfire in the wilderness. The thought surprised him. For so long, fire had been part of everyday morning fire, evening fire, fire in rain, fire in snow, fire beside rivers, fire beneath mountains, fire beneath the endless sky. Now the journey was almost over. Soon, perhaps, they would sleep inside houses. They would sit beside fireplaces. They would no longer need to search for dry wood before darkness arrived. The thought was comforting, but it also felt strange. The wilderness had become part of their lives. Lewis sat beside the flames. The men ate dinner. The conversation was quieter than usual. Everyone seemed to be thinking about home. One man spoke about his family. Another talked about the first meal he wanted when they returned. Someone else joked about sleeping in a real bed. The others laughed. The laughter was soft. The fire crackled. The stars appeared. Lewis looked upward. He wondered how many times he had looked at those same stars during the expedition. Hundreds of nights, perhaps more. They had watched over the men without ever changing. The stars had seen them leave. They had seen them cross rivers. They had seen them struggle through mountains. They had seen the Pacific. And now they were watching the travelers return. Lewis wondered whether the stars made every journey seem small. From the ground, the expedition had felt enormous. Thousands of miles, countless obstacles, long months. But from beneath the stars, a journey was only a tiny movement across a much larger world. That thought did not make the journey less important. It made it feel peaceful. Human beings traveled. The earth remained. Rivers continued flowing. Mountains remained standing. The stars continued shining. And eventually every traveler became part of the memory of a place. Lewis looked at the fire again. A piece of wood cracked, a spark rose, it disappeared into the darkness. The men slowly prepared for sleep. Lewis remained beside the fire. He wanted to remember the moment, the smell of smoke, the warmth, the sound of the river, the quiet breathing of the horses, the darkness beyond the circle of light. He knew that someday, perhaps years later, he might remember this exact night. Not because anything extraordinary happened, but because nothing happened. It was simply peaceful, and peaceful moments were often the ones people remembered most fondly. Eventually, Lewis lay down. The blanket was pulled around his shoulders. The fire was still burning. The stars were bright. The night air was cool. He closed his eyes. The sounds around him became softer: fire, river, wind, breathing. Then sleep. The night passed quietly. The fire burned. The wood became smaller. The flames weakened. The embers glowed. The men slept. The river continued. The stars moved. Then the fire disappeared. The campfire went silent. But this time the silence felt almost like a farewell, not a sad farewell, a gentle one. The fire had served them well. It had warmed them through countless nights. Now its work was nearly finished. Morning eventually came. The eastern sky brightened. Birds began singing. The men woke. The fire was rebuilt one more time. The flame appeared. Breakfast was prepared. The men packed their belongings. Then they continued east. The road became easier. The country was becoming more familiar. The men began seeing signs of settlements, faint trails, fences, old roads, occasional smoke in the distance. Civilization was returning. The wilderness was slowly disappearing behind them. By afternoon, the men saw their first distant group of travelers, other people. For a moment, everyone became quiet. They had spent so long away from familiar society that even seeing strangers felt unusual. The travelers passed. There was a brief exchange of greetings, then both groups continued. But the encounter stayed in the men's minds. They were close now, very close. The next days passed more quickly. Each morning brought another familiar landscape. Each evening brought another camp. But the nights felt different. There was less uncertainty, more anticipation. The men talked about what they would do when they arrived, where they would sleep, who they would visit, what they would eat, what they would say, and perhaps most importantly, what they would leave unsaid. Some experiences could never be fully explained. How could they describe the sound of the Pacific? How could they describe standing beneath the Rocky Mountains? How could they explain sleeping beside a river under a sky filled with stars? They could tell stories, they could draw maps, they could write reports, but the experience itself belonged to them. One evening, Lewis sat alone beside the fire. He watched the flames. He thought about the beginning. At the beginning, the fire had represented uncertainty. Now it represented memory. The same simple flame had followed them through the entire journey. And soon they would no longer need it. Lewis smiled. He understood something. A journey does not end when the road ends. It ends when the traveler understands what the road has given him: patience, knowledge, friendship, memory, perspective. The journey had given them all of these. The fire burned quietly. Lewis watched until his eyes became heavy. He lay down. The night was peaceful. The river moved nearby. The wind was soft. The stars were bright. He closed his eyes. The flames continued burning. Slowly they became smaller. The fire weakened. The embers glowed, then faded. The campfire went silent. Morning came. Another fire appeared, but now the men knew only a few more nights remained. Only a few more mornings. Only a few more miles. Home was waiting. The road stretched east, and the travelers continued, quietly, patiently. Together they walked beneath the morning sun. The wilderness slowly disappeared behind them, and ahead, somewhere beyond the next horizon, waited the first familiar place. The place where the long road would finally become home. The campfire that went silent continued. The morning road felt different now. The men could sense it without speaking about it. The wilderness was gradually giving way to familiar country. The trails were wider. The open spaces seemed more traveled. Occasionally, they noticed signs that other people had passed through recently. A wagon track, a broken branch, a distant column of smoke, small things. But after so many months away, small things could feel enormous. Lewis walked quietly beside the river. He had become accustomed to the sound of water. He wondered what it would feel like when the journey was finally over and he could no longer hear a river every night. Perhaps he would miss it. Perhaps he would wake in a quiet room and imagine water moving somewhere nearby. He smiled at the thought. The men continued through the morning. The sun rose higher, the air became warmer, birds flew between the trees. A gentle breeze moved across the grass. It was an ordinary day. But every ordinary day now seemed important. They were approaching the end. And when people know that something is ending, even simple moments become precious. At midday, the expedition stopped beneath a group of trees. The men rested. One of them pulled out a small piece of food. Another shared water. The horses grazed nearby. Nobody wanted to waste energy. The road was still ahead. After resting, they continued. The landscape slowly opened. The river widened. The trees became less dense. Far in the distance, the men could see smoke rising from somewhere beyond the hills. They stopped for a moment. Smoke. Human smoke. Not a campfire belonging to their own expedition. Someone else was nearby. The realization moved through the group. They were returning to a world of settlements. Lewis felt something inside him change. For months, the wilderness had been their world. Now that world was slowly becoming smaller behind them. By late afternoon, they reached a familiar trail. Lewis recognized it immediately. He had traveled this way before. The memory was strangely vivid. He remembered where they had stopped, where the horses had rested, where the men had built their fire, where they had watched the sunset. Now they were passing through again. The same land. A different group of men. The journey had changed them. They continued until evening. That night they camped beside a quiet stream. The men built their fire, but nobody gathered around it with the same feeling as before. They knew the fires were nearly finished. One of the men said quietly, "This may be one of our last camps." Nobody answered immediately. Lewis looked into the flames. Perhaps he was right. Soon there would be houses, walls, roofs, beds, doors, chairs, tables, things that had once seemed ordinary. Things that now sounded luxurious. The men laughed softly. One said he would never complain about a hard chair again. Another said he wanted a meal that did not come from a travel sack. The conversation became warmer. They talked about home. They talked about people. They talked about what they had missed. The fire continued burning. Lewis listened. He realized that the journey had created a strange relationship between the men and the night. They had learned to love darkness. Not because darkness was beautiful by itself, but because darkness meant rest. It meant the day's work was finished. It meant nobody needed to walk. It meant the fire could burn quietly. It meant they could listen to the world. Tonight was no different. The stream whispered. The fire crackled. The stars appeared. The men slowly became quiet. Lewis looked around the camp. He wanted to remember everything. The shape of the trees, the sound of the water, the smell of smoke, the warmth on his hands. The darkness beyond the fire, the tired faces of the men. These were the final nights of the expedition. He knew he would remember them, perhaps not every detail. But the feeling of being almost home. Lewis lay down. He pulled the blanket over himself. The fire remained nearby. The stream continued. The stars moved. Sleep came slowly. The men rested. The fire burned through the night. Its flames rose and fell. Sometimes they were bright. Sometimes they were almost invisible. A breeze moved through the campsite. Fire responded, then became calm again. Hours passed. The fire grew smaller. The flames disappeared. The embers glowed beneath the ash. The campfire went silent. The stream continued. The night remained. And for the last time, perhaps, the wilderness watched over the sleeping travelers without interruption. Morning came. The men woke. Someone rebuilt the fire. But now the morning fire felt different. It was no longer simply the beginning of another long wilderness day. It was a step toward home. The men ate quickly. They packed their supplies. The horses were prepared. Then they started walking. The road became more familiar with every mile. By afternoon, they began seeing more signs of people. A distant farmhouse, a fence, a cultivated field, a road worn by wagons. The men looked at these things with quiet amazement. A fence might have seemed insignificant before the expedition. Now it was a sign of civilization. A field of crops looked almost beautiful. A simple wooden building seemed like a palace. The men were returning to a world that had continued without them. The realization was humbling. While they had crossed mountains and forests, people back east had continued living their ordinary lives. Children had grown, crops had been planted, houses had been repaired, meals had been cooked. The world had not stopped waiting. It had simply continued. Lewis thought about that for a long time. Perhaps that was one of the deepest lessons of travel. The world was always moving, whether you were present or not. The men continued. Near sunset, they saw something they had not seen for a very long time. A group of buildings, not many, but enough. A small settlement. The men stopped. Nobody spoke. They simply looked. Then someone laughed. Another man smiled. Someone quietly said, "People." The word sounded strange. The men had become accustomed to wilderness. Now people seemed almost unfamiliar. They entered the settlement slowly. Heads turned. People looked at them. Their appearance told the story before they could speak. Worn clothing, tired horses, dust-covered equipment, faces shaped by months of travel. The expedition had returned, not completely home yet, but close, very close. That night they camped outside the settlement. The men built one final wilderness fire. The flames rose against the dark sky. There were lights from buildings nearby. For the first time in months, the darkness was not complete. There were windows glowing in the distance. The men looked toward them. Warm light, human light, home-like light. Lewis sat beside the fire. He felt a strange mixture of emotions: relief, fatigue, gratitude, and a little sadness. The wilderness had been difficult, but it had also become familiar. Tomorrow they would leave it behind. He watched the flames. The fire burned quietly. He knew what would happen. The flames would disappear, the embers would fade, the campfire would go silent. But perhaps this would be the last time that silence felt like an ending. Because tomorrow the travelers would wake in a different world. A world of roads, houses, people. And eventually home. Lewis closed his eyes. The fire warmed his face. The distant settlement was quiet. The stars were still visible above the rooftops. The night was peaceful. He breathed slowly. And for the first time in many months, he allowed himself to think only one simple thought: we are almost home. The fire continued burning. The men slept. And the final wilderness night slowly passed beneath the stars. The campfire that went silent continued. Morning came quietly. The men woke beneath a pale sky. For a few moments nobody moved. Then the familiar routine began. The blankets were folded, the supplies were gathered, the horses were prepared. And beside the dying embers, one last small fire was built. Lewis watched the flame. It was no different from all the others. A little smoke, a little warmth, a little light. Yet he knew that soon they would not need to build fires like this anymore. The thought made him pause. He had spent so many months depending on the simple comfort of a campfire that it had become part of his understanding of time. Every evening the fire meant the day was finished. Every morning the ashes meant another day was beginning. Now the cycle was coming to an end. The men ate breakfast. Then they packed the final pieces of equipment. Lewis looked once toward the wilderness behind them, the forests, the distant hills, the open land, the countless miles they had crossed. There was no dramatic farewell. The wilderness did not know they were leaving. The wind continued. The grass moved. Birds flew through the morning sky. The river continued flowing. Nature simply carried on. The men turned east and they began walking. The road ahead was easier now. There were signs of civilization everywhere. Fences appeared beside fields. Wagon tracks crossed the road. Smoke rose from distant chimneys. Occasionally, they saw travelers. People looked at the expedition with curiosity. Some recognized that these were not ordinary travelers. The men were tired, weathered, and carrying the unmistakable appearance of people who had spent a very long time away from civilization. Lewis watched the faces of the people they passed. It felt strange to see ordinary life again. A farmer working in a field. A child running beside a house, someone carrying firewood, a woman standing in a doorway. Simple things. But after the wilderness, these ordinary scenes seemed extraordinary. The expedition continued. By afternoon, they reached a larger road. There were more wagon tracks, more travelers, more signs of human activity. The men exchanged greetings with people along the way. Each encounter made the journey feel more real. They were coming home. That evening, they did not need to search very long for a campsite. They stopped near a small settlement. The men built a fire, but this time the fire was almost unnecessary. There were lights in nearby houses. Warm light came through windows. The men looked toward them. Someone laughed. Almost forgot what windows looked like. Others laughed too. Lewis smiled. For months, the campfire had been their only light after sunset. Now there were lamps, lanterns, candles, windows, human voices. The wilderness had been replaced by civilization almost without them noticing. Dinner was prepared. The men sat around their final campfire. Nobody spoke for a while. They simply watched the flames. Lewis thought about the first fire of the expedition. He remembered the excitement, the uncertainty, the enormous road ahead. At that time, they had no idea how many fires they would build. They could not imagine the mountains. They could not imagine the Pacific. They could not imagine the long road home. Now all those unknowns had become memories. The fire burned quietly. A small log shifted, sparks rose into the darkness. Lewis watched them disappear. He realized that the entire expedition could almost be understood through those sparks. A spark appeared, it rose, it traveled briefly through the darkness. Then it disappeared. But while it existed, it was visible, it mattered. The journey had been the same, temporary, difficult, beautiful, and unforgettable. The men began talking about the first days. They remembered mistakes. They remembered storms. They remembered strange encounters. They remembered mountains. They remembered the ocean. They laughed about moments that had once seemed serious. Time had changed the memories. The hardest days could now become stories. The frightening moments could now become lessons. The exhausting nights could now become memories of friendship. Lewis listened. He felt grateful, not because the journey had been easy, it had not. He was grateful because they had experienced it together. The night grew deeper. The nearby settlement became quieter. One by one, lights disappeared from windows. The fire remained. The men prepared for sleep. Lewis stayed beside the flames. He wanted to watch them for a little longer. He thought about all the nights beneath the stars, all the times he had sat exactly like this. The same warmth, the same movement, the same quiet. But tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow they would continue toward home. And soon the journey would become a story people would tell, a story people would write, a story people would remember. Lewis lay down. The blanket felt warm, the fire crackled softly. He closed his eyes. For a while he listened to the familiar sounds. Then his breathing slowed, sleep came. The fire continued burning. The night passed quietly. The flames became smaller. The wood turned black. Embers glowed. The last flame disappeared. The campfire went silent. But unlike the nights before, another light remained. A lantern glowed in a nearby house, then another. And another. Civilization had taken the place of the fire. Morning came. The men woke. They packed their belongings. They did not need to rebuild the fire. They were leaving early. Lewis looked back once. The ashes remained on the ground, a small reminder of the final night. Then he turned away. The expedition moved east. The road ahead was familiar now. People recognized them. News traveled quickly. The men realized that their return would not be quiet. People wanted to hear about the journey. They wanted to know what lay beyond the mountains. They wanted to know about the rivers, the distant lands, the Pacific, the places that had existed only as blank spaces on many maps. But before they could tell anyone, they had to finish the road. So they continued, day after day. The distance became smaller. The country became increasingly familiar. And eventually, the men began recognizing places they had not seen since the expedition began. A hill, a river, a road, a settlement. Everything seemed both familiar and strange. They had left as explorers. They were returning as different men. Lewis looked toward the road ahead. He knew that soon the journey would truly end. The final miles remained. And then there would be a doorway, a familiar face, a meal, a bed, silence, no wilderness, no watch for storms, no need to search for dry wood. No need to listen for animals in the darkness, just home. The thought made him smile. The road continued beneath the afternoon sun. The expedition moved east, slowly, patiently, together, and somewhere ahead, beyond the next hill, waited the place where the journey had begun. The long road was almost finished, but the memories of the campfires would remain long after the final flame went silent. The campfire that went silent continued. The road seemed almost ordinary now. That was perhaps the strangest part. After everything they had experienced, the final stretch of the journey did not arrive with thunder or celebration. There was simply another morning, another road, another sky. The men woke early and began moving east. The country around them was becoming increasingly familiar. They passed fields that had been cultivated by other travelers. They saw more wagons, more houses, more people. The sounds of civilization slowly replaced the sounds of wilderness. Instead of distant animal calls, there were voices. Instead of only wind and water, there were wagon wheels. Instead of darkness filled with stars, there were small lights in windows. The men noticed every change. They had spent so long away that ordinary life seemed almost remarkable. At midday, they stopped beside a road. A traveler passed them and asked where they had come from. One of the men answered simply, "From the west." Traveler looked surprised. "How far west?" The man smiled. "Far. That was all he said. How could anyone explain it in a few words? The distance was too large. The memories were too many, so the men continued. That evening, they stayed near a small settlement. There was no need to build a large camp. They could hear people nearby. Someone was speaking. A horse moved, a door closed. The sounds were unfamiliar after so much silence. Lewis sat outside for a while. He looked toward the sky. The stars were still there. That had not changed. No matter where they traveled, the stars had remained above them. He found comfort in that. The world had changed beneath them. But above them, the night was the same. He remembered sleeping beside rivers. He remembered snow-covered mountains. He remembered the Pacific. He remembered countless nights when the only light came from a small fire. Now the lights of the settlement were brighter. But somehow the old campfire still felt more personal. It had been theirs, built by their hands, fed by their work, shared by the entire group. Lewis wondered whether he would ever sit beside a fire in quite the same way again. Perhaps not. Some things belonged to a particular time. The men ate dinner, then they rested. There was laughter nearby. A dog barked. Someone called from a house. Lewis smiled. The sound of ordinary life was comforting. He lay down. There was no need to worry about animals approaching the camp, no need to watch the weather, no need to wonder whether the trail would disappear in the morning. For the first time in a long while, sleep felt completely safe. His eyes closed. The night passed. No campfire was needed. A lantern burned nearby. Then the lantern was extinguished. Morning came. The men woke and continued east. The days became shorter. The distance became smaller. Soon they reached places they remembered from the beginning of their expedition. The sight of those places created a strange feeling. They had left as travelers heading into uncertainty. Now they were returning with the uncertainty behind them. The same roads, the same rivers, but different men. One afternoon, Lewis stopped beside a familiar river. He looked at the water. He remembered standing here months earlier. At that time, the journey ahead had seemed endless. Now the journey behind them seemed almost impossible to believe. He knelt. He touched the water. It was cool, familiar. He remained there for a moment. Clark stood nearby. Neither man spoke. They did not need to. The river seemed to say enough. It had been there before them. It had watched them leave. Now it was watching them return. The expedition continued. That night they built another fire. Lewis sat beside it. This fire was smaller. There was less need for warmth. But he enjoyed watching it. The flames moved gently. He remembered the first fire, then the second, then the hundreds that followed. He could not remember them all, but he remembered the feeling. A circle of light surrounded by darkness. A place where travelers became friends. A place where tired people rested. A place where stories were shared. A place where tomorrow could wait. The fire crackled. Lewis looked around. The men were quiet. Everyone seemed lost in thought. Perhaps they were remembering too. The night grew colder. The men prepared for sleep. Lewis stayed near the fire a little longer. Then he finally lay down. The flames continued. The night was still. The stars were bright. He closed his eyes. Sleep came easily. The fire burned for several hours. Then the flames became smaller. The wood collapsed into glowing embers. The embers slowly faded. The final light disappeared. The campfire went silent. But this time the silence was almost beautiful. There was no uncertainty, no wilderness stretching endlessly ahead, no unknown mountains, no distant ocean. Only the road home. Morning arrived. The men woke. They packed. They continued east. And as the sun rose higher, something appeared in the distance. A larger settlement, more buildings, more people. The men slowed. They could see movement everywhere. Horses, wagons, people walking, smoke rising from chimneys. It was unmistakably a world they had known before the expedition. One of the men laughed quietly. Another adjusted his clothing. Someone looked at his worn boots. They all knew how they must appear. Months of travel had changed their clothing and faces. But beneath the dust and exhaustion were the same men who had left, only older, only wiser, only more experienced. As they approached the settlement, people began noticing them. Some stopped, some stared. Then someone recognized them. The news began spreading. The expedition had returned. The men were alive. They had crossed the continent. They had reached the Pacific. They had come back. Lewis heard the growing excitement around him. But inside, he remained strangely calm. He thought about the quiet nights, the campfires, the rivers, the mountains, the ocean. Those memories were louder inside him than the voices around him. He looked back toward the road they had traveled. For a moment, he could almost imagine the wilderness beyond the horizon, the endless land, the distant mountains, the silent forests. the forgotten campsites, the ashes of countless fires. Then he turned forward. The road behind him was becoming memory. The road ahead was home. The men continued into the settlement. People gathered, questions began. But before answering, Lewis looked toward the evening sky. The sun was beginning to set. He smiled. Even after everything, the sunset looked the same: golden light, long shadows, a quiet sky. The day was ending. And for the first time in many months, Lewis knew exactly where he would sleep that night. Not beside a river, not beneath a tree, not beside a mountain, not beneath the open wilderness, but somewhere with a roof, somewhere warm, somewhere familiar, home. The thought stayed with him as the evening settled over the town, and somewhere far behind them the wilderness remained quiet, the trails remained, the rivers continued, the mountains stood, the Pacific rolled against the western shore, and the ashes of old campfires slowly disappeared into the earth. But the journey was finished. The fire had gone silent, the road had ended, and the explorers had finally come home. The campfire that went silent, final journey home, the first night back among familiar people, felt almost unreal. The men were surrounded by voices, questions, laughter, movement. After months of wilderness, the sounds of civilization seemed strangely loud. Lewis listened quietly. People wanted to know where they had been, what they had seen, what lay beyond the mountains, how far the rivers traveled, whether the ocean was really as enormous as people imagined. The questions continued. Lewis answered some. Clark answered others. But there were moments when both men simply smiled. How could they explain everything? How could they describe months of walking in a few sentences? They could talk about rivers. They could talk about mountains. They could talk about the Pacific. They could show maps. But the nights were harder to explain. The quiet nights, the cold nights, the nights when rain fell on the trees, the nights when snow covered the ground, the nights when the men sat around a small fire and said almost nothing. Those moments had become part of them. Later that evening, when most of the excitement had faded, Lewis found a quiet place away from the crowd. He looked toward the night sky. The stars were visible above the rooftops. They looked familiar for a moment. He imagined the wilderness. A distant river, a dark forest, a small fire, a group of tired men sleeping beneath the stars. He closed his eyes. He could almost hear the water, almost hear the wind, almost hear the crackling of a campfire. Then he opened his eyes. He was home. The thought felt strange. Home, such a simple word. Yet after traveling so far, it carried a different meaning. Home was not simply a place. It was something a traveler carried inside himself: memories, people, sounds, smells, faces, the feeling of being expected somewhere. The expedition had changed his understanding of home. Before leaving, he had thought of home as a place he belonged to. After returning, he understood that home could also be something he carried with him. The rivers had become memories. The mountains had become memories. The Pacific had become a memory. Even the campfires had become memories. But memories were not gone. They remained, quietly, like embers beneath ash. The next morning, the men began telling their stories. People gathered to listen. The explorers described the journey. They talked about the vast rivers, the mountains, the unfamiliar lands, the peoples they had encountered, the animals they had seen, the weather, the difficult crossing, the long nights. Every story made the journey seem larger. But Lewis knew there was something the stories could never fully capture. The feeling of standing alone beneath an enormous sky, the feeling of hearing a river in darkness, the feeling of waking after a storm, the feeling of seeing the Pacific for the first time. Those moments belonged to the travelers. And perhaps that was enough. Days passed. The expedition became part of conversation. Maps were studied. Reports were written. People talked about the Western country. The journey became history. But Lewis sometimes returned to the memory of the fires. He remembered how a tiny flame could transform a wilderness campsite. Without the fire, darkness seemed enormous. With the fire, the darkness became manageable. A small circle of light was enough. He thought about that often. Perhaps life was similar. People did not need to illuminate the entire future. They only needed enough light for the next step, enough warmth for the night, enough courage for the morning. The expedition had taught him that, one step. One river, one mountain, one campfire, one morning, and eventually home. Years later, people might remember the great achievement. They might remember the names. They might remember the maps. They might remember the Pacific. But Lewis would always remember something smaller, the sound of a fire burning quietly beside a river, the warmth against tired hands, the soft voices of companions, the stars above. And the moment when the final ember disappeared, the campfire always went silent, but morning always came. That was perhaps the simplest lesson of the entire journey. Night was temporary, cold was temporary, distance was temporary, fear was temporary, even exhaustion was temporary. Morning returned again and again. The explorers had learned to trust that. When the fire went silent, they knew another fire could be built. When the road disappeared, another path could be found. When the mountains seemed impossible, they could still be crossed. When the journey seemed endless, another morning would eventually arrive. And now the journey was over. The final fire had gone silent. The road had brought them home. The Pacific was behind them. The mountains were behind them. The rivers were behind them. But the memories remained. Lewis looked toward the western horizon one final time. He imagined the land stretching away, thousands of miles, rivers, forests, mountains, open plains, and beyond everything, the ocean. He smiled. Then he turned back toward home. The evening came. The sky became dark. People returned to their homes. Lights appeared in windows. The streets became quiet. Lewis rested. For the first time in a very long time, he did not need to prepare a campsite. He did not need to gather wood. He did not need to check the weather. He did not need to wonder where the next day's water would come from. He could simply sleep. And so he did. His eyes closed. The world became quiet. No river beside him, no wind through the trees, no horses shifting nearby, no fire crackling, just peaceful silence. And somewhere inside that silence was the memory of every campfire, every night, every road, every mile. The journey had ended. But the story would continue through memory. People would tell it, people would write it, generations would learn the names of the explorers. And perhaps somewhere someone would imagine what those nights felt like. A small fire beneath a huge sky, a river moving through darkness, a few tired travelers resting after another long day, the flames rising, the flames fading. The final ember glowing softly, then disappearing, the campfire going silent, and morning coming once more. Because that was the rhythm of the journey. And perhaps it is the rhythm of every long journey. We begin, we travel, we become tired, we rest, we continue, we arrive. And when the road finally ends, we carry the journey with us. The night grows quiet, the stars remain, the world continues, and somewhere in the distance another morning is waiting. So let the final image remain simple. A dark wilderness beneath the stars, an old campsite beside a quiet river, cold ashes where a fire once burned. No voices, no footsteps, no movement, only the gentle sound of water. The fire is gone, the journey is complete, and the night is peaceful. The explorers are home, the road is quiet, the stars are above. And there is nothing left to do, only rest, only breathe, only sleep. The story of the journey is finished. But the silence after the final fire belongs to the night, and the night belongs to sleep.